400 years ago, a village by the name of Amsterdam set out to conquer the world, invented capitalism as we know it, and became the richest city on the European continent.
There was this sense among the Dutch that whoever you were, you could have a piece of the action. You could be involved in this great economic activity of your society.
100 years later, London, its main rival, took its place. The greatest trading power in the world, London endured terrific hardships, but went on to become the world's largest city and invented the megalopolis of tomorrow's world.
When the railways crashed through the poorer areas of London, people were just dispersed. They were swept aside, you might say.
Meanwhile, New Amsterdam had now become New York. It was under British rule. The city cut itself free and entered the fray. At the outposts of technical revolution, New York became the vertical city and created a whole new horizon for itself.
You watched day by day as this stone structure was being built in the middle of the river, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger.
Today, we admire the beauty of the city's houses and the charm of its canals. But there's much more to Amsterdam than that. It marks the starting point of a great adventure, that of the rise of liberal capitalism, the expansion of worldwide commerce, and the emergence of the global city. A combination of circumstances that has rarely been seen in human history, and one which changed the face of the world. Amsterdam was still just a small town of less than 30,000 inhabitants, a town of small consequence in terms of the European continent. On this spring morning of 1594, near Dam Square, which has been the heart of Amsterdam since its very origins, 10 men held a meeting. The meeting took place in one of the participants' houses, a certain Martin Spill, a brewer by profession. Around the table sat men whose businesses traded wood, salt, and herring, products which Amsterdam had become a specialist in. Their ships were, however, excluded from the trade of pepper and spices with South Asia, the most lucrative products around. Because this form of trade was run by Portugal, which owned a huge number of trading posts along the route to Asia, serving as stopovers for its trading boats and as bases for its warships. On the day in question, it was this very monopoly that was at the heart of their discussion.
And the idea is we can attack the Portuguese monopoly on trade with the Far East. And they realized that by this time, the city of Amsterdam has developed, it's got money, it's got these people with this kind of expertise, they've been building ships. So in other words, all the ingredients are coming into place.
Each of the men present that morning had already amassed a fair amount of capital. But it was nothing compared to what they'd soon own and the veritable empire they'd contribute towards founding. Among them was Dirk van Os, one of the city's most dynamic traders. Originally from Antwerp, he was a refugee, like many of the men who attended this meeting. They moved to Amsterdam following a conflict that had been ravaging this part of Europe for the past 25 years. On one side was William the Silent, who was championing the cause of the Dutch Protestants. On the other side was Philip II of Spain, an uncompromising Catholic and one of the most powerful men on the continent. When the northern provinces revolted, he put them to fire and sword. But Amsterdam and the Netherlands finally gained their independence, whereas Antwerp and Flanders remained under his control. Antwerp was, at that point, the main commercial city in Europe, the richest city in the continent, a primordial source of taxation for Philip II and his kingdom. However, the King of Spain made a bet, which would cost him dearly.
They knew that one way or another, you couldn't lock up all the merchants. Money is mobile. So they perhaps uniquely said to those, the inhabitants of Antwerp, there is a choice. You can either stay with us, you have to convert to Catholicism if you're not yet a Catholic, but you could also leave and you have 3 years to liquidate your assets and take them with you.
Half of the inhabitants of Antwerp, who were often more enterprising, chose to leave. Many of them left for London or Germany, but ultimately chose to settle just 200 kilometers from their city of origin, in Amsterdam. The richest among them bought themselves a house in the small medieval town. But those who couldn't afford to do so built their own homes outside the city walls, on agricultural land. There would soon be dozens of thousands of people here, waiting for a better solution. For these refugees, it was the start of a new life, and when a chance presented itself, they weren't going to miss it.
They sit down with their cartographer, they've got all the people there, and they work out a system of how they're going to do this, a route they're going to go, what ships they'll need, and they form a company, which they call the Compagnie van Ver, which translates as something like the Company for Faraway Lands.
It's fair to say that this small group were well prepared. A man named Cornelis de Houtman was sent to Lisbon in Portugal, where he would work for several years and spy on the leading market players. He knew what he was doing, and despite his lack of experience, he was designated by the group as the leader of this expedition.
The total amount invested was 300,000 Dutch guilders, an enormous amount. Even the richest traders in Amsterdam didn't have these kinds of sums available in cash. A house in Amsterdam cost around 5,000 Dutch guilders, and that would get you a very beautiful house. So they needed to involve a lot of traders in order to raise such a sum of money. Certainly, dozens of traders were involved as investors in this initial campaign of Houtman's.
3 ships. 249 crew members. Nobody in Holland had ever undertaken a voyage this far. Moreover, should they cross into hostile territory, the Portuguese could at any moment intercept the expedition and destroy their ships. Plagued with scurvy and rebellions, the voyage did not go well, and Houtman had to stop over for several months in Madagascar, before setting sail for Asia and ultimately reaching Bantam, on the island of Java. Nothing was left to chance. During his stay in Lisbon, Houtman realized that this was somewhere where he'd be able to buy pepper and spices. But when he reached his destination, he was met with disappointment. The Sultan, who initially greeted him warmly, took him prisoner. Houtman escaped, and after several journeys, on August the 14th, 1597, he returned to Amsterdam.
More than 2 years later, about 80 of the original 200 and some people make it back. They look like skeletons, and they've got just a few sacks of pepper and spices in their hold. So by any logical means, this is a complete disaster. Except that handful of men who backed the voyage realized they had done it. They had actually gone the whole way there, somehow or other gotten their hands on some of the spices and came back. So they'd beaten the Portuguese, and they realized then that this was an opportunity. This was going to work.
Amsterdam now needed to gather enough resources that it would need for its global ambitions. It needed ships, lots of ships, and as quickly as possible. And it just so happened that, in 1594, that is to say 3 years before Houtman's return to Amsterdam, one man found the answer. His name was Cornelis Corneliszoon, and he owned several mills in the village of Uitgeest, near Amsterdam. Cornelis Corneliszoon was a great inventor. He helped Holland harness wind power. Until this point, sawing planks of wood required several men and lots of patience. But this all changed when Cornelis Corneliszoon developed the crankshaft. This revolutionized shipbuilding production.
The crankshaft is actually a very simple invention that converts a circular movement into a vertical movement. With this new technique, it was possible to produce planks of wood, which were mostly used for shipbuilding, 30 times faster than before. This considerably lowered production costs and sped up the shipbuilding process, which made the production of ships, large ships, much cheaper. And you have to remember, this was happening at the end of the 16th century. The patent dates back to around 1592 to 1594. In other words, exactly at the time when the Dutch set off on their huge explorations.
At first, the invention met a lot of opposition, and many shipyard workers refused this piece of innovation. But within a few years, its usage became more widespread, and Holland's advantage over its foreign competitors was overwhelming. Amsterdam was now the leading shipyard in Europe. And that's where they mass-produced the best trade ship of its time. The 5 years that followed were full of excitement. More and more expeditions were launched, and many shipping companies were founded. 75 ships were sent to Asia.
And the ships start coming back loaded with these incredibly valuable spices. And this is really the moment that the Dutch Golden Age takes off. There's a scene that's described by several writers where when these first ships come back, all the church bells are ringing because this is just this, awareness that something really big has happened.
These expeditions brought back 9 million Dutch guilders, which equated to the total sum of Holland's national debt. The debt amassed during the war against Spain.
They couldn't carry on this way forever, because all these companies would eventually start competing. They all wanted to travel to Asia and buy spices. The prices in Asia started climbing, which nobody was happy about. And the second problem was the Portuguese and Spanish, who didn't want to relinquish their spoils to the Dutch. There needed to be a well-organized and centralized company with a monopoly of the market, and one that would be able to defend itself against the Spanish and Portuguese. And so, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, was created.
It's a key date in the history of capitalism, as well as that of Amsterdam. One morning in April 1602, Dirk van Os transformed a room of his house into a temporary office for the Dutch East India Company, of which he'd just been nominated a director. Whoever wished to could buy shares of this new company.
There was this sense among the Dutch that whoever you were, you could have a piece of the action. You could be involved in this great economic activity of your society.
1,143 people seized this opportunity. Not just traders, but also joiners, bronzesmiths, and all sorts of craftspeople, and even 7 people who worked as housekeepers. It was a sample of society in Amsterdam at that time. A total of 3,680,000 Dutch guilders were invested in this new shipping company, a huge success for the first operation of its kind in the history of the economy.
Dirk van Os and his house, in this moment when these ordinary people came walking into his house to buy shares of stock, might have an outsized place in history because this is you could say, the moment that capitalism was born.
But there was a problem. The investors were used to investing in a single voyage. They had to wait, and when the ships returned, they'd get their money back and could either choose to continue or stop investing. But with the VOC in 1602, they were told, you can invest, but for 10 years. Your money will be held for 10 years.
And 10 years was much too long for many small investors. The VOC found the solution on a small bridge, which can now be found outside the exit of Amsterdam station. This area, in the early 17th century, was home to the city's port and its many ships, which were ready to set sail out to sea. On the old bridge, the one nearest the sea, those who wanted to sell their shares of the VOC would meet those who wanted to buy them. But the weather in Amsterdam wasn't always accommodating. And on rainy days, people would meet inside the St. Olaf Church, a Catholic church that had been abandoned during the Protestant victory and since left to the traders of Amsterdam who'd come from Scandinavian countries. This place, to some extent, became the first stock exchange to exist in human history.
The process was you did your exchange on the bridge or in the church, and then you walked to the headquarters of the Dutch East India Company and you had to get signatures and stamps. And so that sealed the deal, that made it official.
The Dutch East India Company headquarters are now part of the University of Amsterdam. It was the first headquarters in the world, with its offices, managers, and board of directors. The edifice is the work of Hendrik de Keyser, the leading architect at that time. He's the one they called when, as stock trading activity increased, they decided to build a proper stock exchange. Hendrik de Keyser had 2 models to work with: the stock exchange in Antwerp and its copy, the stock exchange in London. But Antwerp was in enemy territory, so Hendrik de Keyser went to England. Here, only merchandise was traded. Company shares did not yet exist. But the architecture was interesting, and Hendrik de Keyser used it for inspiration. Once back in Amsterdam, he built an edifice based on the same model. Its location is no coincidence. The new stock exchange was built right in the centre of Amsterdam, a stone's throw from the city hall. A sign that finance and politics would work hand in hand. In Amsterdam, unlike London, merchandise was being exchanged, but so were shares of the Dutch East India Company. In this regard, the Amsterdam Stock Exchange became the first in the history of global economics. The stock exchange was inaugurated in 1611. Meanwhile, a truce was being signed between the Dutch Republic and Spain. Temporarily relieved of the burden of its war debts, the city would finally have the resources to expand. In the space of 30 years, 10 square kilometres were dug up, around 100 bridges were constructed, and 3,000 houses were built. With 30,000 inhabitants in 1585 and 105,000 30 years later, Amsterdam would soon be the third largest city on the European continent. The next part of this story took place in London, at the heart of the city, the business district. Back then, much like now, it was a city of traders too. In the early 17th century, London had not yet undergone its urban revolution. It was still a city in the Middle Ages.
Well, it was actually a very small place compared to London we know now. A tiny fraction of the scale of the city as it exists in the 21st century, even in the 19th century.
The city is currently a crucial financial hub, and not many people live there. But back at this time in history, most of the population of London was still mostly living here.
And the city was the area confined to the old medieval walls, which had been built on top of the old Roman walls. So really a very small space, what we call a square mile.
A place that was made up of medieval houses, packed very closely together, essentially of timber. There are some new structures amongst them, but it was very much a medieval city, very old-fashioned.
The city was separate from the royal power. The sovereigns needed money lent to them by traders, who would, in return, receive a certain degree of freedom. England's great fortunes had their home there. In 1534, when Henry VIII split from the Roman Church, he seized all the Catholic monasteries. Until this point, they occupied 60% of the city's space. The king redistributed this among his courtiers.
And so when the king appropriates that wealth for himself, you have a change in ownership of the property of more than half of the buildings in the City of London. And they move from conservative landlords, who are the churchmen, to go-ahead entrepreneurs, the merchants, who are buying the church property as investments. In a period of maybe 50 years, London becomes a place which is actually filled with extremely wealthy people living in their own very large houses. And these people spent the winter months in London with their wives, and their wives wanted to go shopping. And shopping is absolutely the key to what happens to London. It becomes this extraordinary emporium where people come and buy and sell high-value luxury goods.
At the start of the 17th century, the City of London was therefore a rapidly developing commercial centre. But it was still far behind Amsterdam. And when the two cities came up against each other, the City of London would come up short. Back then, much like now, in the city, business people often have confidential information disclosed to them. Especially in pubs, where eavesdroppers would often overhear conversations.
Pubs are places where people meet. Pubs are the social hubs, and business centres need social hubs as much as residential areas. Work is primarily a social activity. The British, unlike most other nationalities, drink standing up rather than sitting down. If you're sitting at a table in a French cafe, all you hear is the gossip of your friends. You can never quite hear what's being said on the next table, which is always far more interesting than what your friends are saying. In a British pub, no such problem. Because you're standing up, you can easily get close enough to the other group to hear what they're saying, and you can switch off from what your friends are saying, which you already know anyway.
Strategic information could fall into the wrong hands, which is exactly what happened in late summer of 1608. And this changed the fate of London, Amsterdam, and even the whole of America. That morning, a certain Henry Hudson had a meeting in the offices of the Muscovy Company in a little street of the city called Budge Row. The Muscovy Company was specialised in trading with Russia. And it's not the first time Henry Hudson had put himself in their service.
Henry Hudson had spent many years undertaken many voyages to try to find a short route to Asia.
On 2 occasions, Hudson tried to find the right route. The first one went via the North Pole, which obviously didn't work. And the second attempt went via the far north coast of Russia, and wasn't successful either.
I think of him as kind of like a Steve Jobs or someone like that of his era who, people started to look to him as someone who knows. Whether or not he did know, and we know today that he did not, but what you had to do was you had to guess. You had to say, I'm going to put all this information together, and my next guess is that this is the best way.
This time, Hudson had a new idea. Instead of travelling towards the east, they'd have to cross the Atlantic and the American continent. That's what he was explaining to his employers. However, inside the building, nothing happened as he'd expected. Not only did they refuse his offer, but they showed him to the door. That said, this incident didn't go unnoticed. A 62-year-old man, Emmanuel van Meteren, quickly seized the opportunity. As the Dutch consul in London, he'd look for every piece of information.
And he had spies. He paid people to find out information. And one of the things that he was following was Henry Hudson. And he found out very quickly that the Muscovy Company had fired Henry Hudson. And so he approached him and said, come to Amsterdam, we'll fund you.
London had just missed an amazing opportunity because Hudson was quickly persuaded. And a month later, he sailed to Amsterdam.
He comes to Amsterdam, and there are different accents, there are different languages, there's different dress. It's the very moment when they are building their first stock exchange and starting the idea of expanding this canal grid. So it's all just happening, and this multi-ethnic polyglot society is something that would have been very strange to him.
Hudson discovered a new world, a mixed population with many refugees, unlike his city of birth.
In Europe, intolerance is official policy. And if you're in London, basically you're English. This is still that moment when, that kind of identity is intensified and codified by law almost.
Here, there was no king or absolute power, but a republic formed of 7 provinces. They all had to reach a compromise for any big decision. When the city became Protestant, the Catholic churches were converted into the general places of worship. But there were still many Catholics in the city. They represented 1/3 of the population, and their faith had not been banned. Their churches were simply no longer visible. They were now in individual homes. There were 66 churches like this during the Dutch Golden Age. Everyone knew that services were held every Sunday, but they were tolerated. At a time where Europeans were killing each other for religious reasons, this was proof of a greater openness. And it's a legacy that Amsterdam passed on throughout the Golden Age, across the entire world.
So Hudson goes into the courtyard of this now legendary building, which was the headquarters of the East India Company, meets with the directors, and they hammer out an agreement by which they will fund his voyage.
On one condition, however. Hudson would not head west, as he'd proposed, but would find a shortcut to Asia through Russia.
They, for their own reasons, insisted that he try a northeast passage. He had tried that and failed. He was convinced that wouldn't work. But from one line in the contract, we know that there was tension, and the line says something like, Hudson will think of taking no other route than a northeast passage, which suggests that he was saying, no, we want to go northwest, we want to go northwest. And they were saying, no, we want you to do northeast.
In May 1609, as he set sail for Russia, the seafarer was under no illusions as to his chances of success. But he had other intentions. Having only just arrived in Norway and facing the difficulties they'd encountered, he persuaded his crew to do a U-turn and to head towards America. The Indians, so we're told, mentioned a waterway that wound its way far into the depths of the continent. Hudson looked for it along the north side, turned round, and finally found the river mouth. He made his way down this river, which would later take his name, the Hudson River. But after a few days of sailing, he had to face facts. It was a dead end. So Hudson turned back on himself. Along the route, he met some Indian tribes, some hostile, others happy to trade. And he saw lots of beavers, whose fur was worth a fortune in Europe. Amsterdam had not found the sea route it had been looking for, but the city had set foot on the American continent. The year Hudson returned was also the year Amsterdam underwent its transformation.
Amsterdam, until that time, was still this little medieval city, but from that moment, they undertake this vast urban expansion program.
A few years earlier, a new district had popped up in the northeast of the medieval city. Many refugees from Antwerp had settled there. The less wealthy were living on top of each other in the 3,300 small homes built outside the city walls.
They lay out a plan for a belt of canals, a kind of U of canals that will wrap around the medieval center of the city. And the canals will be used to take the problem of water and convert it to an advantage.
A team was put together to carry out this ambitious project, and Hendrik de Keyser was one of the men in charge.
At the start of the 17th century, this construction company was formed of around 150 people. Specialists, craftspeople from various fields, masons, carpenters, sculptors, and this number just kept growing. And we know that in the mid-17th century, it had between 600 to 700 employees.
There were huge difficulties because Amsterdam is built on marshy land, whereas each building needs a solid foundation. As such, hundreds of ships travelled back and forth to the Swedish port of Stavanger to bring dozens of thousands of tree trunks to Amsterdam. Amsterdam was transforming itself into a huge, bristling construction site of wooden triangles, on top of which heavy loads were being hoisted. And so, this is how the posts necessary for the foundation of such construction were buried into the ground. 1 post per metre across the entire city.
So I have often thought that, if you were walking through Amsterdam in its golden age, I think really you would have been struck by this sound of hammering and of the piles being driven, because that was going on all through the century as this belt of canals was dug and these roads and bridges and houses were being built.
The perimeter of the city wall was extended. The refugee homes were demolished and 2 new districts emerged. A residential district. And on the outside was a commercial and residential area for those with fewer means. It was the first town planning scheme in the history of European cities. In the commercial area, each profession had its own area. Whereas in the residential areas, it was forbidden to make noise and no polluting forms of industry were tolerated. Here, everybody was free to build the house of their choice to the size and style of their pleasing. There was only one restriction. The house could only occupy half the surface of the plot of land.
And what's unique about the houses in Amsterdam along the canals is that each of them has a garden.
Amsterdammers die daar nou woonden.
The inhabitants of Amsterdam who lived in these houses, the wealthy traders, the bankers and men in power, were passionate gardeners and wanted to create palatial gardens at the heart of the city. And the Dutch way of designing these urban gardens was characterized by their different designs. There were boxwood hedges, plant beds, topiary, original plants. There were also statues, benches, garden pavilions. Everything you'd find in a palace garden could be found here, but on a smaller scale, in a smaller space.
On the ground floor of the house, there'd be a reception area. Next door would be the office, where one's business would be run, with 1 or 2 employees. Upstairs was the family space. Family in the strict sense of the term, as we know it today.
Before that, European homes tended to be much more mixed. You may have extended family, there might be servants or boarders who are renting rooms. The Dutch canal house, and this again reinforces this new notion of what an individual is, and not just an individual, but what a family is. This new kind of sensibility, which I think most of us consider now, today, to be part of our lives. The Dutch canal house was intended to be for a man and his wife and their children. The Dutch have this word, gezelligheid. It means cozy, intimate, a place of domesticity.
When you read the tales of foreigners who walked along the canals in the mid-18th century, they seem surprised that there are so many high-value houses and no sovereign. They are also surprised that this architecture is not solely used for the houses of rich individuals, but that even simple public buildings are built this way too. Orphanages, retirement homes. They thought, it's really quite astonishing. And they even thought it's a bit excessive to design public buildings like palaces.
Amsterdam would now start exporting this revolutionary societal design to the other side of the Atlantic. (1623) marked the creation of the Dutch West India Company, which had a monopoly over trade with the Americas. A year later, it invited volunteers to its headquarters in Amsterdam to join its new colony.
It's the golden age in Holland, and it's hard to get settlers. So they are advertising, and they have this multi-ethnic society, and as you would imagine would happen, it's people who are at the bottom rung of the society who are willing to, they're the ones who have nothing to lose, who say, okay, I'll join.
Young people in their 20s, a boy for each girl. All from French-speaking Flanders, now Belgium. In 1624, a few dozen volunteers signed up for this American adventure. At that point, Amsterdam and the Dutch Republic were, without contest, the world's leading commercial power. However, on the other side of the North Sea, London was building up its forces. Its secret? Textiles, a force born 250 years earlier in terrible circumstances. The greatest epidemic in European history. The Black Death. Half of the English population were wiped out in the space of a decade. But it was at this point that the English economy discovered sheep farming.
Before the Black Death, there was a very high population. The economy was geared towards agricultural produce to feed this population. But after the Black Death, there was what they called a dearth of people. There were very few people, and there was a lot of land. And so the economy changed, and they made use of the huge amount of land by switching the economy from this agricultural economy to sheep farming.
Wool supplies were gathering in London, and for the next 2 centuries, the city traders exported it, particularly to Amsterdam and Holland, where a great number of some of the best weavers on the continent were working.
Now, this was all very well. Exporting wool was very good. It was a cargo that made good profit. But there was a way to make even more profit. And that was to not only send wool abroad to allow people to make cloth out of it, but to make the cloth yourself and then sell that with its increased added value.
In the mid-17th century, London finally decided to take the next step. The weavers of Holland were invited to move to the English capital, as well as French Protestants, the Huguenots. Among them were many textile craftsmen. London thus sowed the seeds for its future industry.
They settled in the east of London, near to the City of London and close to the port where they had arrived from the continent. They built houses with weaving lofts at the top of the houses with large windows and plenty of daylight to operate their looms for making cloth. And this early development of the cloth industry in the UK was what really allowed the economy of London to take off, which produced the great wealth that led to it becoming a financial centre.
The weavers formed the initial hub of the future East End, the major industrial district of the 19th century. And the port in London saw its activity increase tenfold. In a space of 50 years, the population of London more than doubled. By the mid-17th century, it had amassed 500,000 inhabitants. The medieval city grew beyond its confines and rapidly spread towards the west in the direction of Westminster. Westminster, where the king reigned, and he saw urbanisation sprawl beyond control.
There were real anxieties about the expansion of London because it was this place of disease, of vice, of crime, and the idea that the city might expand, might get bigger, was an incredibly worrying thing for that reason.
In his palace in Whitehall, the king dreamt of a different city. A city devoted to royal greatness. The example to follow, according to Charles I, is the banqueting house, one of the wings of his palace. With its classic design, the building was used for great royal ceremonies. It was built by his father, King James I. The king, featured in these ceiling paintings, done by Rubens in person, celebrate glory. The two sovereigns made life difficult in London. By imposing all sorts of regulations, they wanted to force it to change.
But they had a problem. Unlike European monarchies, where the monarch, genuinely had the power to completely remodel city centres, James I and Charles I were completely dependent upon Parliament, and the City of London government had a complete stranglehold, complete control over the nature of the city. And so their hands were tied.
London became one of the bones of contention between the king and Parliament. And the conflict contributed to the Civil War, which devastated England in the mid-17th century. Charles I was defeated, sentenced to death, and decapitated on 30th of January 1649 in front of the banqueting house, the palace he'd so dearly loved and recommended as an example to be followed. It was a terrible period, but the city emerged richer and more powerful than before. Because this is when the first banks set themselves up in London, and financial business became a formal profession. Until this point, things had been done in an informal manner, mostly in settings like pubs. A rich tradesman would sit at a table from which he'd hold business meetings. A person who wanted to borrow money would come up to him, accompanied by another person who'd act as a guarantee. And the rich tradesman, if he deemed them suitable, would lend them the money they'd requested. But this practice changed after the death of Charles I. A few months after his execution, Oliver Cromwell became Lord Protector, a sort of dictator, and allowed Jews to return to England. They'd been deported several centuries beforehand. As such, Jewish bankers moved to London from Lombardy in Italy. They chose a street in the city centre, now called Lombard Street, and set up their offices there. These were the first office blocks, such as we know them today. However, the newcomers still maintained a vestige of the old practices. This type of sign, which all English pubs worthy of this name would hang outside and would be named after.
Pubs and coffee houses had done this for a long time. They'd always had a picture outside, a picture of the king or a picture of a castle or something more unusual. And so it is in Lombard Street that to this day we see a collection of signs hanging from buildings that look very much like pub signs. They don't have any words on them. They are the world's first logos. So when we see the cat and fiddle over a building in Lombard Street, this is because it was the visual symbol of the company, the bank that operated within, very much as had been the case in the days of pub banking.
In the space of 50 years, the city had carried out its transformation. From a commercial centre, it was now becoming a financial hub. England now had the means required for its ambitions, and a first war soon broke out between London and Amsterdam to take control of certain sea channels. But Amsterdam continued to grow, an incredible success which aroused keen interest from all around.
Years ago, a village by the name of Amsterdam began its mission to conquer the world, invented capitalism as we know it, and became the richest city on the European continent.
There was this sense among the Dutch that whoever you were, you could have a piece of the action. You could be involved in this great economic activity of your society.
100 years later, London, its main rival, took its place. The greatest trading power in the world, London endured terrific hardships, but went on to become the world's largest city and invented the megalopolis of tomorrow's world.
When the railways crashed through the poorer areas of London, people were just dispersed. They were swept aside, you might say.
Meanwhile, New Amsterdam had now become New York. It was under British rule. The city cut itself free and entered the fray. At the outposts of technical revolution, New York became the vertical city and created a whole new horizon for itself.
You watched day by day as this stone structure was being built in the middle of the river, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger.
special about the DNA of New York is that unlike other American cities, other American development, it doesn't start with religion. It doesn't, frankly, start with idealism. It doesn't start as an experiment in let's leave a place where we're being persecuted or we can't fulfill our identities. Let's go do something idealistic, perhaps even utopian. No. What is New York about? New York is about making money.
What is unique about New York is that it was expressly founded as a commercial place by a commercial entity, the Dutch West India Company. They were here to trap beavers and send the pelts back to Europe. New York was a place to capture animals and turn them into money.
Spring 1624. Amsterdam's first settlers make their way to America. On board are 15 young boys and 15 young girls, some of whom became couples during the journey. Upon arrival, they split into 4 groups, 4 tiny colonies, each separated by several hundred kilometers. And it was 1 year later, in one of these colonies, that the destiny of this handful of adventurers would change dramatically. The colonies had trade relationships with the Mahican tribe, who were at war with the Iroquois tribe. So they came to the defense of their business partners, but they fell into an ambush, and 5 of them were killed. In this time of tragedy, a new leader stepped in. His name was Peter Minuit. As a means of protection, he ordered all the colonists to gather together. From then on, there would no longer be 4 isolated colonies, but one single settlement, which they named New Amsterdam. The settlers decided to settle on an island located at the confluence of 2 rivers, at the heart of a huge bay sheltered from the harshness of the ocean. They had access to sources of clean water, which meant it was quite easy for them to build a small town. At the time, the site was used as a hunting ground by the Lenape Indians, which they'd named Mannahatta, the island of many hills. And so one day, Mannahatta became Manhattan. It was this land bursting with potential that Peter Minuit and the Amsterdam settlers exchanged in 1626 for a few items, the value of which is estimated at 60 florins. In other words, the equivalent of 2 weeks' pay.
If you're doing history, you gotta slow down, peel back the layers, and get down to these people at this moment and what they thought they were doing. Nobody was looking ahead 200 years later, or 300 years later, or 400 years later, when a one-bedroom co-op would sell for $1 million or something like that. They know perfectly well that the Indian idea of property ownership is not their idea of property ownership. It's kind of a defensive alliance. So we'll allow you to live here too, and if you're attacked, we'll help you, and if we're attacked, you'll help us.
A fortified camp and a small village. The settlers finally had a solid base. However, for 10 years, the colony wasn't able to expand, and this is largely down to the West India Company, who wanted to control everything.
The West India Company insisted on running this colony as a monopoly. So any money to be made, it's through them. So everybody is a West India Company employee. And it's failing. And the people who are making money are smugglers or prostitutes. Those were kind of or pirates. These are the main, successful businesses, so to speak.
In Amsterdam, the situation was becoming worrying. In 1640, at the West India Company headquarters, the managers finally decided to open trade to whomever was interested.
And what starts to happen then instantly is the successful Dutch trading companies would send one of their sons to New Amsterdam, and they would set up a branch office. And because the Dutch Republic is a ethnically mixed place, the settlers are ethnically mixed.
15 years later, the population of New Amsterdam had multiplied by 5 and now exceeded 4,000 inhabitants. The small village had become a small city and a smaller model of the great metropolis across the other side of the ocean. Brick houses and canals, which made it look rather like the Dutch Republic. Of course, all of this has long since disappeared, with the exception of the narrow streets of New Amsterdam, which can be found at the southern tip of Manhattan. The famous New York canyons, where the skyscrapers seem to touch each other, are the legacy of the island's first European inhabitants, almost 400 years ago. On this new continent, a colony so small in size was vulnerable, so a wall was built along its northern edge. This protection was not against the Indian tribes, but against New Amsterdam's 2 English neighbors. While in Europe, war was breaking out between England and the Dutch Republic, Boston and Philadelphia were a threat they needed to protect themselves from. Years had passed since the start of the Dutch Golden Age. Amsterdam's belief in its future was resolute, and this building is the best expression of that belief. A few years previously, the old town hall, a legacy of the Middle Ages, had burnt down in a fire. Its replacement was built entirely out of stone in a neoclassical style. Built on a foundation of 13,659 timber piles, its construction was a real achievement. In the middle of the town hall is a huge central hall called the Burgerzaal, the Citizens' Hall. Everyone has access to it, both the rich traders and those with modest means.
Wat dus eigenlijk daar verteld wordt, is natuurlijk, het draait allemaal om de stad Amsterdam. Dus Amsterdam als middelpunt van de wereld, maar eigenlijk van de kosmos, van het universum.
Embedded in the marble floor of the Citizens' Hall are 2 planispheres. Symbolically, when the inhabitants of Amsterdam walked into this huge space, the world would be at their feet. The city of Amsterdam is portrayed as a female goddess who reigns benevolently over the entire planet.
En eigenlijk kun je zeggen, daar is het, dat het middelpunt van de Burgerzaal is eigenlijk de as waar de wereld om draait. En het gebouw is dan ook heel precies oost-west georiënteerd. Werkelijk ook in een soort, om deze macrocosmische setting nog verder te accentueren. Het is de centrale ontmoetingsplek en eigenlijk een overdekt plein, zou je kunnen zeggen, waar de voorname burgerij elkaar ontmoeten en dus wandelt over de kaarten van de wereld.
Beneath the Citizens' Hall, in the building's basement level, was Amsterdam's financial core. This small room was the central bank, which held access to the city's gold reserves, thus acting as a safe for the city and its inhabitants. The city therefore dominated global trade, with the average income per inhabitant 3 times greater than in other large cities on the continent. And with this money came all sorts of possibilities. This money meant it could complete the huge urban project it had started 40 years previously. Between 1650 and 1670, the canals were extended by several kilometers and hundreds of houses were built. It was one of the largest developments to take place in Amsterdam during the Dutch Golden Age, and it was no doubt the most successful. At this point, large families were opting for a more sober architecture, which never goes out of style, with stone facades that stand the test of time. An architecture that distanced itself from the early Amsterdam, when the beginnings of merchant capitalism had only just emerged. Now, the city was entering into an era of maturity.
De schoonheid van deze architectuur zag men dan ook niet in het ornament, in het fantasierijke beeldhouwwerk, maar eigenlijk in het ritme, het maat en ritme van harmonie en proporties, van vensters, deuren, lengte en breedte, en die dan geaccentueerd werden door pilasters, die dat ritme dat in dat gebouw zelf aanwezig zit, dan voor het oog afleesbaar maken.
The age of conquests, great adventures and new fortunes was mostly over. In 50 years, real empires had been established, not only in trade, but also in finance and industry. The history of this house, the biggest private house in Amsterdam, tells us the story of one of the dynasties that reigned over the economy of the Dutch Republic. A family that, within 2 generations, created a truly multinational entity, whose base was located in Sweden, where they produced iron and traded weapons. The house belonged to the Tripp brothers. Their uncle Elias had started from nothing. Upon his death, his personal fortune was worth 1 million florins, which is the equivalent of 4,000 years' worth of an average salary. His successors, Louis and Hendrik Tripp, continued to grow the family fortune, and it was they who built the house, which was, in actual fact, a single facade that concealed 2 adjoining houses.
The Tripp brothers sell to anyone who is willing to pay, including the enemies of the Dutch Republic. The Dutch had a lot of enemies, and if you didn't sell to the enemies, there wasn't that much business left to do. But the other reason is that, interestingly, the authorities in the Dutch Republic are aware of the fact that doing business with everybody brings in revenue. So ultimately it supports the Dutch state, and if they wouldn't buy those arms from Dutch merchants, they would go somewhere else, and that would support perhaps the enemies of the Dutch Republic.
Toen het huis voltooid was, was het ruim 2 keer zo hoog als alle bebouwing die er links en rechts en tegenover stond. En als je op de bovenste verdiepingen van dat triphuis stond, keek je dus over eigenlijk alle naburige huizen uit. En het enige gebouw dat je in de verte zag, dat een gebouw dat dezelfde hoogte had, was het nieuwe stadhuis.
The town hall was a place where only families from Amsterdam could work. But the Tripp brothers were from a village located about 50 kilometers outside. They were therefore excluded. This largely explains the position and height of their house. Its existence was an act of defiance against the city's political authorities.
En op het dak staan schoorstenen die zelfs de vorm hebben van mortieren. En je kunt je voorstellen, vroeger oorspronkelijk in de wintertijd, als die schoorstenen daadwerkelijk functioneerden, dan kwam er dus rook uit die kanonnen op het dak. Dan had je echt rokende kanonnen als schoorsteen op het dak. Nou, hoe symbolischer of directer kan eigenlijk een verwijzing zijn naar de wapenhandel en de kanonnengieterijen die zij zelf bezaten.
Amsterdam had now spread to 4 times the size it was in the early 17th century, and its population had exceeded 200,000 inhabitants. As Europe's third greatest city, it was well aware of its power. But London was laying in wait, and it was ready to overtake its rival. As such, on the 8th of December 1664, New Amsterdam became New York. This date, the city we know today was formed, with its mix of populations and unwavering commercial ambition. With utmost secrecy, the English had sailed towards New Amsterdam, taking the small city's inhabitants and governor by total surprise. Peter Stuyvesant had led this Dutch colony on the other side of the world for 17 years. He knew his enemies well. They were his neighbors and his best clients.
For many years before this point, the English colony in Virginia, when they were shipping things to England, they would send them to New York Harbor and have the Dutch do it, because the Dutch could do it cheaper, they could do it faster. They just had developed, for over a couple of centuries, they had developed systems for handling these things.
Up against the 4 English ships and their powerful artillery, New Amsterdam didn't stand a chance. And so Peter Stuyvesant had no choice but to invite his enemies into his own home. However, despite this blatant show of strength, the English conceded practically everything to the small city they'd just conquered.
And it's an interesting document because if you read it point by point, you wouldn't know it's like these are the conquerors and these are the conquered, because it seems more like a negotiation between 2 equals.
The inhabitants of New Amsterdam were allowed to keep their properties, trade as they wished, and retain their right to decide on matters concerning the city. And the trading ships that sailed over from Amsterdam would still be welcome.
When there's a takeover, you have in your mind this notion that, these people leave and these other people come in. They all stayed. And even 20 years later, notaries in the Dutch Republic are writing documents to send people, settlers, Dutch settlers, to the colony, and they're still calling it New Netherland, like they don't want to think about it, And just to jump ahead centuries, like in the 19th century, when the great waves of migrants come from Europe to America, by and large, they come into New York Harbor and they first make footfall on Manhattan. And they look around and they see what's now this teeming society with people speaking different languages and worshiping different faiths, and they're all struggling to get ahead by what we would call upward mobility. And they say, well, this is America, but it wasn't America. The rest of America wasn't like that. It was New York. And it was New York because it had been New Amsterdam.
In 1643, while New Amsterdam only had a population of 500, one visitor recounted that 18 languages were being spoken there. This mix within a population was passed on to the city of New York, and that's what gives it its identity to this day. The initial mark made by New Amsterdam is no longer visible, but it is ever present. In this regard, Haarlem finds its root in the small town of Haarlem, near Amsterdam. Broadways is in Breedweg, which means wide road in Dutch. Brooklyn is named after Breukelen, another Dutch city. Coney Island comes from Conyon Island, which means Rabbit Island. And Staten Island comes from Staten Island, the States General, the governing body of the Republic in the Dutch Golden Age. In New York, the spirit of Amsterdam and London had in some ways fused, giving America a very unique city. And this is also why it's important to understand the story of Peter Stuyvesant, who, straight after his defeat, left for Amsterdam to report back to his superior. Stuyvesant showed up at the West India Company headquarters to defend his decision to hand over the colony to the English. Once exonerated, he decided to head back to New York, where he spent the rest of his life, in his house where he'd signed the famous Treaty of Capitulation. The 2 years that followed England's seizure of New Amsterdam were horrific for London and its population. In 1665, the plague killed 100,000 people. And the following year was the Great Fire.
London then was a city of thatch, timber, plaster, all building materials that are very flammable. The previous couple of summers were very dry, so London was this tinderbox ready to go.
St. Bartholomew the Great Church was one of the only buildings to escape the flames. It was in these rather dramatic circumstances that London took its first step into modernity.
I think it's really difficult today to get any sense of how catastrophic the Great Fire of London actually was. Particularly as when it started, it seemed like it was just another one of the hundreds and hundreds of fires that happened every year and that were dealt with and put out and controlled. And even after the fire had been raging for 24 hours, it wasn't really understood what it was going to mean for London. People were moving their goods further to the other side of the city. People were putting their goods in St. Paul's Cathedral in the illusion that they would be safe in there, and of course they weren't.
The fire broke out in a bakery on the night of the 2nd to 3rd of September 1666, and then it subsequently took hold. Although it only claimed 9 victims, more than 100,000 inhabitants saw their houses reduced to ashes.
And it burned until Wednesday, the 5th of September, and destroyed a third of the city in that time. So I try to conceptualize what that would mean to inhabitants at that moment. If you think of a third of London now was destroyed, it's that kind of magnitude of event.
The fire had done what the kings of England had never managed to do. The medieval city had disappeared. It could now be replaced with a new city.
I think nobody really understood what to do next. There was no manual they could go and get off the shelf saying, catastrophic fire, page 47, this is what you do. There was a real vacuum of power. And into that vacuum came 2 very powerful interests. One was the commercial interest, which said, just get up, get going, we just can't afford to mess about, we've just got to get on. And on the other side was an opportunity.
You had to move quickly. Half the population of the city were camping out in areas that had avoided the fire. What should be rebuilt? A new city? What should it look like? One man had the answer to each of these questions. His name was Christopher Wren. He was a brilliant mathematician and a very talented architect. Wren was a close friend of King Charles II. He'd known him since they were children. The year before, the king had sent him to Paris in what was, in some ways, a spying mission. There, he met Bernini, the architect behind the Vatican, who would be asked to design a new facade for the Louvre Palace.
And Wren says in a letter that he writes back, "I brought back all Paris with me on paper. Big trunks full of books, sketches, drawings, prints, maps. These were all brought to London, and we have to imagine him undoing this big trunk and putting the papers out on a table in front of Charles II and saying, 'We could do this, we could do this, we could do this.'"
Christopher Wren was in Cambridge, where he was teaching when he heard about the fire. He immediately travelled to the royal palace to meet Charles II. Wren had prepared for this for a long time and couldn't wait to seize upon such a dream opportunity. And so, before the king, he unfolded his plan for a completely new city.
Totally un-English, because all of London's previous history had grown up through the individual acts of entrepreneurs and merchants and individuals. Here was something that was being proposed that would be imposed by the state.
Christopher Wren wanted to eradicate the traces of the medieval city and build a capital formed of large squares and wide avenues. A royal capital, not dissimilar to the large cities across the continent.
This was an absolute catastrophe, because clearly anything that was going to be state-directed was going to take ages to implement and therefore was going to interrupt the important business of making money. And of course, the people who wanted to make money won, because London has always been about making money. London was invented by the Romans to make money.
The city was therefore rebuilt on the outline of the old city, but with brick houses. It was the birth of a modern city, a city that now found its calling.
13,500 houses were burnt, only 4,000 houses were built back. And so London begins to change from being a place of dense population to a concentrated trading centre.
As for Christopher Wren, although his city plan didn't come to fruition, he was put in charge of rebuilding St. Paul's Cathedral. At 111 metres high, it was the biggest building in London and the biggest in Europe at the time. Even today, the cathedral is a symbol of the city, the old medieval city of London, which, having disappeared in the Great Fire, later became the first business district in the history of economics.
Had Wren's plan been realised, we would have been a beautiful Parisian city, useless for the function of being a world financial centre. A city which was so grand, so beautiful, so complete, so perfect, it couldn't continue to change and be adapted. The great constant in London's history is the constant of change. As London has never been planned, it can easily be rebuilt and remade. It is in a constant change in its physical form, as well as in its technology and its forms of doing business.
From a disaster, London had invented a new urban form. And so the failure of Christopher Wren's design of his perfect city opened the way for the city we know today.
As London as a city became more and more commercial, it became a less fashionable place to live. And so the rich and the fashionable moved out to the west. And there they were able to build larger houses, houses that had gardens, and houses that, instead of being crammed in on these narrow streets, were set around large, carefully planned squares.
The model of using squares came about 40 years before the Great Fire, with the creation of Covent Garden, an Italian-style square, a Tuscan-style church, and a collection of houses. A very successful project that inspired all the aristocrats who owned property in and around London. The square therefore became a good way to make one's fortune. The principle was as follows. The king gave a piece of land to one of his courtiers. Said courtier or one of his descendants would develop it and consult an entrepreneur. The entrepreneur would take care of everything, gathering income from the houses they'd built, and would pass back a share of it to the courtier. This continued from generation to generation for a century, at the end of which the courtier's family would regain full ownership of the land. They could then decide to use another entrepreneur who'd build more houses and return a share of the income back to the landowner or their descendants. It was through this ingenious system that West London, that is to say the chic districts, were able to develop.
The square was a very clever invention because, at least initially, the people who lived in these houses were extremely wealthy. They may well also have owned, as well as their house in a square, a vast country house somewhere in the country with many rolling hectares of land. So they wanted their townhouse to look grand.
In the 18th century, they were no longer squares, but little parks that sat in the middle of these districts. Small, very select parks that were only accessible to the occupants of the houses facing them.
By creating what we call a terrace, which is a row of houses together, and approaching it, you feel, if the terrace is designed as a single structure, as if you are approaching a great palace. But in reality, you are approaching one slither of a great palace. Your servants lived downstairs, and upstairs in the attic, and in the sandwich in between, lived the family. And so the squares and these great terraces were very popular with the rich because it gave them a sense of status, a sense they were living in an impressive palace, where in reality they were living in a very manageable residence in the city.
These types of property projects were mainly aimed at aristocrats to begin with. But it wasn't long before the upper middle class took an interest too. And naturally, the rest of the middle class wanted to copy it.
The aristocratic developments of these great squares set a fashion, and the fashion trickled down. And so whilst the aristocrats lived in very big, tall terraces, maybe 6, 7 stories high, with huge squares covering maybe a couple of hectares, the middle class, the clerks, the people who were working in the city, had slightly smaller houses, which were built on a very similar principle, on smaller squares with slightly narrower streets.
Here, a simple developer could buy some land, build and then rent out houses. The first to do so was called Nicholas Barbon.
As a person, he was incredibly difficult, ruthless, ill-tempered, would not let anything stand in his way. He trained actually as a doctor of medicine in Leiden, and he returned to London at this moment after the Great Fire, when it was emerging as this new place reborn, this newly emergent modern city. He saw building very much as a commercial enterprise. He was the first speculative developer, and he found as many possible ways to save money himself.
Barbon did everything in sequence. The stairs, the plaster mouldings, the chimneys and the window frames. In doing so, he amassed a considerable fortune and was soon being imitated by dozens of other developers. This is how London started growing at a frantic pace. It was on its way to becoming the most widely spread and highly populated city in the world. And it kept repeating the same urban model again and again, the square model, which it had invented following the tragedy of the Great Fire of 1666. London was the rising power, Amsterdam was the established power, and France was to be the referee for this merciless rivalry. In 1672, the Hall of Mirrors did not yet exist, but it marks the memory of a conflict that shook Europe and changed the history of these two cities forever. London and Amsterdam had already been met with two wars, and until now, the Dutch Republic had always won the battle. 3 years earlier, the Dutch Navy had even invaded England and had crept up on the enemy navy along the Thames. Most of them had been destroyed. Ever since, the English had dreamed of nothing but revenge. Louis XIV saw this as an opportunity. The King of England, Charles II, was his cousin. He admired the King of France and his absolute power. The two men were on good terms and formed an alliance in Dover. In early spring, war broke out, and for Amsterdam, the situation was very dangerous. England had formed an alliance with Paris, but also with the communes of Münster and Cologne. Danger was therefore coming from all directions.
The French troops entered Dutch territory. They moved quickly to positions very close to Amsterdam. It looked as if Amsterdam itself might be conquered by the French. That didn't happen. But a major part of Dutch territory was occupied by foreign forces, really for the first time since independence. One of the problems that the Dutch have in the 1670s is they have to maintain a huge army to fight Louis XIV. That army is about 100,000 soldiers, possibly even more. And this implies that every 20 Dutch men, women, children, 20 of them together are paying for one soldier. And that becomes impossible to sustain.
The Dutch Republic finally won the battle, but the country emerged from it exhausted. As for its opponents, it was better luck next time. "16 years later, the same scenario seemed to be transpiring. Louis XIV supported James II, Charles II's successor to the throne of England. So it was therefore possible to establish a military alliance between the two countries. But their enemy was a determined man. William of Orange was not a king, but a symbolic character within the Dutch Republic, of which he was also the army chief. His family tree alone was a perfect synthesis between the Dutch Republic and England. William was the grandson of William the Silent, who, a century earlier, had won the war against Spain, to which the Dutch Republic owed its independence. Charles I of England, the king decapitated in 1649, was his grandfather. His wife, Mary, was the daughter of the current king of England at the time, James II. The man who hoped to ally with Louis XIV to annihilate the Dutch Republic was therefore his father-in-law. These very close connections to London were a great asset, and William used it to his advantage. With great secrecy, he mounted an extraordinary armada. 500 warships crossed the sea.
He takes a large invasionary force across, 25,000 men, as well as 60,000 copies of a pamphlet in which he says this is not an invasion. I am English.
William of Orange claimed that he was defending the country's interests against its own king, James II, whose diabolical advisors had imposed an arbitrary government on the population. And the argument worked. James II, King of England, fled to France, and when William reached London dressed in white to signify the purity of his intentions, he was applauded and received the support of Parliament.
The deal is that William, together with his wife Mary, become the new sovereigns of England. For Parliament, the deal is that they will have the final say on all important issues.
Parliament granted William and Mary the Bill of Rights and the habeas corpus, which, for the very first time, established the limits of a sovereign's power and respect for individuals' freedom. This episode was later called the Glorious Revolution. The royal couple were crowned in Westminster Abbey in 1689 and ruled together for a decade. After which, the Dutch Republic and England, now united around their two sovereigns, were able to resume their independence. But within the space of a few years, William managed to incorporate his own little country's values into his new kingdom. Individual rights, tolerance, a moderated government system. By the time both sovereigns died, these values were already perfectly instilled. This all cost the Dutch Republic very dearly. It was another financial burden for a country already in substantial amounts of debt. At the beginning of the 18th century, Amsterdam was still a large capital city, but its heart wasn't in it. One clue indicates that the times were changing. Painting, throughout the Dutch Golden Age, had been one of the great passions of the Dutch Republic. Whereas until then, throughout Europe, art had been the privilege of princes, aristocrats, or very large families. Here, it had been democratized.
Al die grote huizen, maar ook de kleinere huizen, waren rijkelijk voorzien van schilderijen. Zien we dus dat er in de 17e eeuw ongeveer om de weg 1 miljoen schilderijen gemaakt moeten zijn. Niet alleen in Amsterdam, maar in de hele Republiek. Een bakker en een schoenmaker hebben toch al gauw 5 à 6 schilderijen. Grote collectioneurs hebben er 40 à 50. Maar het hebben van schilderijen is eigenlijk iets heel wijd verspreids. En is eigenlijk zoiets als je nu posters aan de muur hebt.
Amsterdam was the birth of the individual. Everyone wanted to showcase their existence, or their profession, like a jeweler, or their daily life.
If you look at the journals and diaries and letters of travelers from other parts of Europe, they would come to Amsterdam and be on the Dam or another market, and they would find it amazing that you would see a fish seller and a vegetable seller, and then you'd see an art seller right next door. And then you would see ordinary people going and buying these paintings, and the paintings would not be of a saint or something like that. They would be of ordinary people doing ordinary things, like selling vegetables or a woman pouring milk into a bowl or something like that. None of them are important today, but all of them have a Wikipedia page today. All of these people, these portraits hang in the Louvre or the Rijksmuseum or the Metropolitan Museum. And it's because of this. It's because they're the first people who looked at themselves the way that we look at ourselves.
The War of 1672 was a terrible blow, which impoverished the country and ruined many art lovers. Vermeer, now a celebrated painter, had no more customers. He started facing financial problems, and he never got back on his feet. However, there were some who set off for London. Van der Velde the Younger and Elder, for example, two marine painters famous for their strikingly lifelike paintings depicting scenes off the coast of the Netherlands, found their new customers in England.
Of course, it would be really nice if we could say on a particular day the Dutch Golden Age came to an end. But that's not the way it works.
Amsterdam's decline was the product of a slow degradation. But in 1715, the Dutch Republic took a decisive step, which reduced their credit and dissolved their power. The Dutch Republic defaulted on its debt. It was only temporary, but it was a step too far.
This is something that only happened to royals. So there was a kind of an idea in the Dutch Republic among all those bankers and people who put their money into the public debt, that you had monarchs who had flimsy characters and therefore they defaulted on their debts. But in the Netherlands, you had this solid institution made up of businessmen who knew what they were doing. It wouldn't happen to us. That was the kind of feeling. And then it happened to us. And so this is also the start of a debate that takes basically all of the 18th century, where people are saying, what did we do wrong and how can we get back into paradise?
But paradise had been lost. Amsterdam was now a city almost like any other. It's in New York, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, that this story finds its end. Amsterdam had had its golden age in the 17th century. 2 centuries later, New York experienced its Gilded Age.
By the 19th century, late 19th century, the industrial era, New York is this powerhouse, and it's filled with these extremely wealthy men who become obsessed with art and culture and, of course, European art and culture. And they are now suddenly buying up Europe and sending their representatives to Europe to buy up its history. And they're bringing it to America and founding these museums so they can, in effect, look back on their own roots, on these very wealthy tycoons from the 16th and 17th centuries who were their forebears.
The Prince of Sugar, the Baron of Railways, the King of Abattoirs, or the creator of the first department stores in America. These huge collectors bequeathed these masterpieces to museums around New York City. By the end of the 18th century, Amsterdam had fallen off the pages of this great story. London and New York now stepped out in front. On both sides of the Atlantic, 2 rival powers would now dominate the world and face the challenges of modernity. 2 fast-evolving cities shaken by both industry and new technologies. 2 cities in their extreme forms, both extreme poverty and immense fortunes. They went on to invent the megalopolises we know today.
400 years ago, a village by the name of Amsterdam set out to conquer the world, invented capitalism as we know it, and became the richest city on the European continent.
There was this sense among the Dutch that whoever you were, you could have a piece of the action. You could be involved in this great economic activity of your society.
100 years later, London, its main rival, took its place. The greatest trading power in the world, London endured terrific hardships, but went on to become the world's largest city and invented the megalopolis of tomorrow's world.
When the railways crashed through the poorer areas of London, people were just dispersed. They were swept aside, you might say.
Meanwhile, New Amsterdam had now become New York. It was under British rule. The city cut itself free and entered the fray. At the outposts of technical revolution, New York became the vertical city and created a whole new horizon for itself.
You watched day by day as this stone structure was being built in the middle of the river, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger.
At the end of the 18th century, Amsterdam, the leading global trading power, finally had to accept defeat. Industrial revolution and demographic explosion. London would become the dominant power for the following century. But New York had followed hot on its heels and caught up within a few decades. Now, competitors, the two cities were to be the first to face the impact of modernity. 21st of September 1776. While the War of Independence raged, New York was up in flames. Half of the city was reduced to ash. It was disastrous, but also heralded a fresh start. Since its very foundation, New York had never stopped growing. But once the city was freed from British rule, it underwent a remarkable development. Over the decades to come, it literally engulfed the island of Manhattan.
Manhattan had an interesting landscape. In fact, the name Manhattan derives from the native word for Mannahatta, which means the island of hills. Manhattan was the island of hills. It was a rolling landscape. No mountains and no deep valleys, but high hills, many of them rocky. It was a beautiful place. But that is not what the commissioners had in mind.
There were three members of the commissioners' plan for the street and road layout for New York. Simeon DeWitt, Surveyor General, the only professional in the team. John Rutherford, former senator, the greatest landowner in the state of New Jersey. Gouverneur Morris, one of the founding fathers of the United States. He took part in the drafting of the American Constitution. In 1807, they were tasked with planning the layout for the future city of New York. 4 years later, they invented the famous grid pattern. This marked the starting point for a huge expansion, which ultimately made New York the economic capital of the United States. At the turn of the 19th century, New York had two key competitors, Boston and Philadelphia. It's at this point that it took the upper hand. Its traders were selling raw materials and buying manufactured products in England and got involved in the trafficking of slaves between Africa and the southern states of the US. This is how they came up with the idea of offering their clients a completely new service.
In Philadelphia or Boston or in London at the time, the standard way of trading was to wait until a ship was full and then send it across the Atlantic, and it would go across the Atlantic and wait at the other port until it was full and come back.
The New York traders therefore proposed a different and much more efficient service. Their ships would set off at a set time, whether or not their holds were full or empty. This way, their customers would know exactly when the ship was leaving and when it would arrive with their cargo. This method couldn't be rivaled, and so New York gained a definitive advantage over its competitors. And that's not all. By sailing north up the Hudson, then winding up a canal to the Great Lakes region, the city was able to fashion itself a path of traffic deeper into the country, and therefore toward its plentiful natural resources. It was a sizable challenge because it stretched a huge distance, almost 600 kilometers. The Erie Canal was the first major construction project in the history of the United States.
People were very skeptical. They were concerned about the amount of money that was being borrowed, and it was just not a sure thing at all. It turned out to be a fantastic thing, and within just a few short years, the toll revenues being collected along the Erie Canal were more than enough to pay off the debt.
The Erie Canal was a small revolution for New York, because until that point, it had been difficult or even impossible to travel around such a vast area. From this point onwards, it was now much easier to transport wood, furs, and soon coal and agricultural production to New York. All the items that would be necessary for its trade and industry.
Philadelphia was the real competition here. Philadelphia tried to build a canal to go west, but west of Philadelphia are mountains. And so they started later. It was more expensive to build because of the mountains. That meant that the tolls had to be higher, so the Philadelphia Canal went bankrupt while the New York Canal just prospered and grew.
You could call the Erie Canal a kind of vacuum, a suction and pressure pump that allowed New York to withdraw produce from within the country and distribute imported products back into the country. So that made the city completely unavoidable in the material sense of the word. You absolutely had to pass through it.
The Erie Canal was officially opened in 1825 and gave the New York economy a considerable boost just as the city was being planned, and the famous grid pattern started taking shape. Both projects were intricately linked, because two of the three members of the Street and Road Layout Commission for New York, Governor Morris and Simeon DeWitt, were also involved in the design of the canal. And this mission took up a great deal of their time.
With time running out on their street commission, they basically punted, which means they cast about for some plan that existed that they might adapt to their purposes because they hadn't really come up with a plan of their own.
Upon searching through the archives, they came across some work done by a man called Casimir Girk. Girk had drawn up the plans for plots of farming land in the center of Manhattan, in a location that was, at the time, worth almost nothing. Through these common lands, he designed 3 avenues, perpendicular roads, and 140 plots, each measuring 2 hectares.
Boom. There it is. There is the Manhattan grid. It comes directly from the Common Lands grid, and what the commissioners did is simply expand it, explode it out from there.
And so, as if by chance, the great grid pattern was born, a pattern without which New York would not be New York.
Many other cities would have their planned core, and then as they expanded, they would plan additional subdivisions and add additional streets. So you never really knew what was coming up next. New York in 1811 lays out this grid that extends almost all of the island of Manhattan. All the streets were at right angles. There was a standard plot size. All the plots were roughly the same size. The avenues were roughly the same size. The streets were roughly the same size. It made every piece of real estate more tradable, more buildable, more developable, more marketable, and it made the real estate market very rational.
12 avenues, 155 streets. The city was about to transform itself into a real estate kingdom. But before it could do so, the island of Manhattan was yet to be conquered. Nature posed a significant hurdle. The land on the isle was very rocky, and its rolling hills were not compatible with the desired grid pattern. And so New York set to work on a gargantuan project, breaking up the rocks and flattening the hills. The old farms were now a thing of the past and were destroyed one after the other. This is how, decade after decade, the city crawled relentlessly further north. Manhattan was divided into almost 2,000 sections of houses, or what are now known in New York as blocks. These in turn were divided into a few dozen sections, which were very narrow and deep, each designed to accommodate an individual house and small garden. But investors immediately started buying several plots at a time, and the land became a simple commodity.
And what that, of course, leads to is speculation, that I'm not buying the property with this notion that I'm going to live here forever and I'm going to pass it on to my child and he's going to pass it on to his child and it's going to be about the great patrimony of the United States. None of that. It's about I buy this property and other people buy properties. It becomes a desirable area and then I'm getting rid of it as fast as I can to buy more property someplace else. You create a kind of regular system and I can just sell it off. I don't have to be describing every pros and cons of this piece of property. I just sell it off to you like it's a car off an assembly line.
Long before the Wall Street Stock Exchange, which later made New York the financial capital of the United States, property was the driving force behind an extraordinary type of growth. The auctioning of plots in New York was a windfall for speculators. And so the first great American fortunes were earned. The temple for this new passion was the Traders' Stock Exchange. It was located on Wall Street, but at a different address to the one that exists today. There, all sorts of commodities were exchanged, but land in the city of New York was the most sought after. It was here that John Jacob Astor began his career speculating on the property market and earned the first great American fortune. Before anyone else, he realized that the city was going to see a huge surge in its population. And he was subsequently proven right. There were 100,000 inhabitants in 1810, but 800,000 50 years later. In that time, the price of land had, unsurprisingly, increased by more than tenfold. Within a few decades, the steamroller behind Manhattan's Great Grid had erased everything, with one exception.
Broadway is really, to my mind, the grid's saving grace. It creates these irregular, angled intersections with the north-south avenues. And these are graceful, urban oases. The only instances anywhere in Manhattan of any irregularity.
Broadway, the great avenue of today, follows the outline of a former Indian pathway. The city plan of 1811 should have erased it, but it provided access to a great number of ranches, the owners of which ultimately demanded that it be left in place. 2 centuries later, it was one of the most famous avenues in the world. Without Broadway, Madison Square and even Times Square would not have existed. Broadway is the legacy of a time where New York was still a little city on the other side of the world. Before the start of the 19th century, it was already heading towards the great metropolis we know today. The East End, the eastern side of London. At the turn of the 19th century, as the British Empire began to grow, products from around the world started arriving in the East End. But London's port was not ready for such an influx of goods. It was simply known as the Pool of London, where hundreds of ships would moor to load or unload their cargo. A multitude of small vessels would continuously come and go on the Thames banks.
You have to imagine this dense congestion of craft moored in the tidal Thames, rising and falling on the tide, and transferring their goods to the warehouses which, still within living memory, lined most of the bank of the river. The tidal range of the Thames is something like 8 meters, so an enormous surge of water flowing in and out of London.
London would have to invest massively to rise to the challenge. This led to the construction of the docks, ports along the Thames that enabled ships to empty or fill their holds much faster.
Each of them specialized in a different type of trade. It might be timber, it might be grain, it might be meat, it might be sugar, it might be rum. And the flow of raw materials from the empire and from world trade into the docks then generated a huge industrial complex. And that was really the basis of the East End.
The East End was now England's leading port, far ahead of Liverpool, and it had more factories and workshops than Manchester.
What you had was narrow streets, lined densely with warehouses, and sometimes with overhead passages which crossed the street and carried the goods to another set of warehouses on the other side. You can still see that pattern. The warehouses have been converted now into luxury dwellings, but you can still see the physical pattern in Rotherhithe and in Wapping.
A huge number of people from Ireland and continental Europe had come and settled in the East End, which in itself became England's second largest city. Subsequently, the railway was built. First came the train, then the underground. London was undergoing a revolution more violent than ever before.
Anybody who had any money in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, 1870s even, plunged their investments into railways. This was the way to make your fortune. And as that happened, these individual projects funded by individual investors brought railways into the city, stopping at individual terminuses. And by the 1850s, there were as many as 19 termini dotted round the outside of London. And someone then had the brilliant idea of joining up all these peripheral railway stations with an underground railway.
Long before electricity, steam trains would go through tunnels which had vents in them to let the smoke out. They were the first underground trains ever invented.
And the Underground Railway solved the problem because it enabled you to get on to one station in the north, to get on the Underground Railway and to move round to get into another station on the east. But the destruction it caused was enormous. In the 19th century, the way you built a railway was to get a private Act of Parliament that gave you the powers to drive your railway through other people's land, to purchase their houses, and to build your stations and your goods yards.
When the railways crashed through the poorer areas of London, people were just dispersed. People would be renting by the week or by the month the home that they lived in. They wouldn't have long-term leases, they wouldn't have security of tenure, they wouldn't have ownerships. The landlords of the buildings were quite happy to make a few pounds by throwing out their tenants and selling the plot to the railway company or selling a lease to the railway company to build their railway through. And the poor people were just totally disregarded. They were swept aside, you might say.
And these people are moved, they're not rich enough to move far, and so they move into more slums, making them more intense and creating worse and poor areas.
Many parts of London changed dramatically in their appearance, and there's a famous Doré etching of the East End of London with railways on brick arches and very low quality housing huddled in below with the steam and smoke belching out of the railway engines down into the residential property below. This was one face of inner London.
The French illustrator Gustave Doré stayed in England on several occasions in the 1860s and drew hundreds of illustrations. Doré was one of those who discovered, to their astonishment, the most populated city in the world, now undergoing significant change. But London, with its mass poverty, industrial districts and slums, was also the capital of the most extraordinary wealth. The Prince Regent, future King George IV, was a very flamboyant figure at the time. One of London's most famous streets is named after him, having been designed by John Nash, his favourite architect. It started at the Prince Regent's Palace in Carlton House. It was the dividing line between the poor and wealthy neighbourhoods.
The east of Regent Street were the slums. On the other side of Regent Street was the fashionable West End.
Piccadilly Circus and Regent Street. They were, and still are, some of London's great emblems.
So Regent Street divided London socially, but it also created the first really architecturally homogeneous piece of architecture, brilliantly designed, following the social fault lines of London. Very picturesque, very elegant, very fashionable, very commercially successful, and very unusually for London, stimulated by state action.
It's now a neighborhood of brick buildings located in South Manhattan overlooking the East River. Cherry Street. A place that underwent one of the most spectacular transformations in New York during the first half of the 19th century. George Washington, the first president of the United States, had a house there, so it became one of the most fashionable streets in the city. But in the 19th century, everything changed in New York. Mass immigration, economic growth, urban explosion. The face of Manhattan transformed.
Population growth was so rapid all through this period of time. There's some decades in the 19th century where we had hundreds of thousands of residents, where the population in just one generation doubles. All these people want to work in New York and live in New York, and there's a limited amount of space. Manhattan is an island, rivers on both sides, so the only place to go is up or to squeeze more people into every block. And the people who invested in New York City land became expert in fitting as many residents as possible onto each one of those lots.
Cherry Street had once been an ideal place for living the sweet life, but immigrants had started settling there in their tens of thousands. And so a new type of building emerged, the tenements. They were perfectly adapted to Manhattan's divided structure and the blocks carved out for individual houses, but not for such an influx of people. Instead of these little houses and their gardens, the tenements filled each plot in its entirety. Initially, a space was left at the back of the building, but as Manhattan's population exploded, they spread throughout the entire block, leaving the occupants with no light or room to breathe.
You're talking about no bathroom facilities at all. You're talking about privies in the backyard. You're talking about what we would think of as absolute slum conditions, but with the added feature that it's intrinsic to the architecture.
Room is the right word. These were not apartments. People, of course, had many children. People are also taking in unrelated boarders or lodgers to help make rent. So you might have in 2 small rooms 15 people living. There would be a small area for cooking, and then people are going to be sleeping in both rooms, sharing beds. There might be people sleeping on 24-hour cycles. You may have some people sleeping at certain times a day, and then others sleeping at other times a day. A lot of work was also done at home, especially in the garment industry. Textiles might be made in a factory, but people were often sewing clothes themselves, working as tailors in their tenements. So there's a tremendous amount of activity. These buildings were extremely crowded. You might have hundreds of people living in a single tenement building, 20 feet wide by 6 stories tall.
There were 100,000 inhabitants in 1810, but 950,000 60 years later. More than half of them lived in a tenement.
And by the end of the 19th century, this was the most crowded place on Earth. Now, that you might think that that's hard to measure, but we have a pretty good idea of what the population was of the other big cities in the world. And there were more people per square mile on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in New York City than there were in the most crowded parts of cities in Asia or in London, which was a much bigger city at this time, but not as crowded per square mile as New York was.
The local authorities tried to bring in legislation, but it only imposed minor changes. At least until Jacob Riis broke the taboo and revealed a reality that everyone until that point had chosen to ignore.
He was a Danish immigrant. He had actually lived for a time on the Lower East Side in a tenement. He worked for a newspaper and was a crime reporter. And he made it his mission to try to reform the slums. Flash powder was invented in Germany, and when Jacob Riis read about this in the newspaper, he had an idea. It proved to be a brilliant idea, and he rode away and sent for some flash powder. It was sent over from Germany, and he learned to become a photographer. He got a camera and started going out and taking pictures of places like Gotham Court, places like Cherry Street. And he took hundreds of photographs, and then he published a book in 1889 called How the Other Half Lives. And there were certain themes he liked to depict. So there's lots of photos of children standing next to piles of garbage, or very menacing looking young men who might be part of a gang holding big sticks and looking very rough. Flash powder was essentially gunpowder. This was literally powder that was ignited using a long fuse that would result in a very bright, very loud explosion. So wherever Riis took photographs, he had to find willing participants. So it was a very manipulative and orchestrated operation. But it was effective. It worked. It convinced mainstream New Yorkers, middle-class New Yorkers, to support housing reform.
How the Other Half Lives, the book by Jacob Riis, was published in 1890. However, it would be another 30 years before the worst tenements were destroyed. The first to go on Cherry Street were only taken down in 1920, almost a century after their construction. Hyde Park, one of the largest and most beautiful parks in the British capital. This is where, almost by chance, a small revolution took place that would change the face of London, but also that of New York. It all started when Queen Victoria, or more precisely, her husband, Prince Albert, decided to organize a great exhibition and design a building for that very purpose.
The problem was that the building had to be relatively cheap, it had to be constructed very quickly, and it had to be able to be moved away at the end.
Prince Albert, who's now commemorated by a memorial located where the exhibition was held, appointed a commission that refused all proposed projects as they were deemed too expensive or inappropriate. At least until Joseph Paxton proposed the most ingenious solution yet. Paxton wasn't an architect, but a gardener. And in the gardens he worked on around the Chatsworth estate, he'd designed greenhouses for growing tropical plants.
And of course, gardening is somewhere where you have to solve problems with the limited materials you have around you in a relatively quick way. A lot of ingenuity is called for from gardeners, and Joseph Paxton was probably the most ingenious gardener that has ever lived.
To host a World Fair, Paxton believed a giant greenhouse would be the perfect solution. All the parts required for its construction could be prepared in a factory. The building's frame would be cast iron, its roof would be glass. It was the first building of this size to be open to the public and totally prefabricated.
Personnel of about 2,000 men were able to construct the Crystal Palace in a period of 8 months because of prefabrication, because glass came in standard-sized pieces and the components that contained and held the glass were also manufactured in factories and brought to the site, ready-made and ready for assembly. Even the drainage system was standardized so that the gutters were also part of the structure of the building. And then the columns of the buildings themselves, the supporting columns, were actually drain pipes to take away the water from the roof. The whole thing was very practical, very engineered.
With its 6 million visitors, the World Fair was a huge success. And it did not go unnoticed. New York, which already saw itself as London's major competitor, refused to be outdone. It immediately chose a location for its own exhibition, on the site of what is now Bryant Park. Its pavilion was also called Crystal Palace, and the discoveries made there were very ahead of their time. It was at this exhibition that Mr. Otis demonstrated his latest invention. He gave the order to cut the rope holding the platform he was standing on. It stopped dead. Lifts could now be trusted. "It's danger-free," Otis yelled to the awestruck crowd. It was the first leap in the race to higher levels, which New York would soon be leading. The second leap was taken 3 years later, a bit further south, in a neighborhood that now no longer stands out due to the height of its buildings. It was here that James Bogardus built his first prefabricated cast iron buildings. Bogardus used the same method that was used for Crystal Palace in London, but adapted it to a building of much smaller proportions. His first building looked like an Italian palace from the Renaissance period, the difference being that its facade was not sculpted out of stone. It was iron, cast in a warehouse. Bogardus designed 3 buildings like this one, all in different styles. And since his invention was so great, it was immediately copied. It led to the creation of a whole neighborhood filled with imitations of antique, Italian or Parisian architecture.
These metallic office buildings, which weren't yet skyscrapers, were 7 or 8 stories high, and they were extremely adaptable because they made it possible to do what Corbusier referred to as free plans. In other words, a very flexible building that can be used for storage or offices. Nowadays, you can use them as artists' workshops. They're the first buildings on this scale using cast iron frames that didn't need load-bearing walls.
It was 4 years later that one such building, the Horwath building, with its revolutionary architecture, was finally introduced to the lift. Today, it has since been modernised, but it was at this very location in 1857 that Mr. Otis installed his first vertical car.
A few people would get into a car and be transported to an upper level. They'd sit on a bench while the elevator rose up slowly floor by floor. Those elevators are driven by steam engines or hydraulic lifts. The technology is extremely primitive. They're not electric motors making them move fast up and down.
Electricity, which would eventually make it possible to equip much higher buildings with lifts, did not arrive until the end of the century. For now, Mr. Otis's invention was being tested on a smaller scale, and it was still just a simple curiosity. In 1870, Manhattan was still a city made up of small buildings. A fairly horizontal city, a city in the making. That year, the summer was stifling, and the stagnant water in the Thames became a swamp with an unbearable stench. It was a period called the Great Stink. The city's population had just reached beyond 3 million inhabitants. There was no sewage system. Pollution was a huge problem. London was the first to tackle it.
Members of the House of Commons who had meetings by the Thames could no longer work. Some meeting rooms were inaccessible because the stench was so unbearable. They doused curtains in chlorine and hung them in Parliament windows to try to alleviate the bad smells, but also to disinfect them, as it was still believed that bad smells carried disease. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Disraeli, was forced to leave a meeting room with a handkerchief to his nose, practically gagging because he could no longer bear to stay in the room. The press were delighted, and they wrote, "Finally, our leaders will do something. They'll finally understand how our people have suffered for a dozen or so years next to this cesspit."
A few weeks later, Parliament voted in favour of building a wastewater collection network. But it dumped it into the Thames, only a few kilometres upstream of London. And this is where, in 1878, the Princess Alice crash occurred. A cruise ship going up the river with 800 people aboard collided with a collier twice its size. 600 people died. Many passengers fell in the water, and it was so polluted that most of them were poisoned. And that's not all. 3 years earlier, in 1873, the city had experienced a period of particularly deadly air pollution. It was smog, a combination of fog, mist and smoke from factories and coal fires in houses. "800 people died in a matter of days."
Witness accounts describe it as a multi-sensory experience. Of course, like any fog, it affected sounds. And more so than other fogs, it blocked people's vision. You couldn't see a meter in front of you. It also affected people's sense of taste and smell. It had a slightly acrid taste to it, a smell that some described as rotten egg, or at least left an aftertaste in their mouth, that's for sure, and it was sticky. It's believed that the Victorians often wore black because they had to protect their clothes, one way or another, because it was impossible to keep your clothes white or clean for long if you lived in London. The fog caused great chaos outside, but it also made its way into people's houses. In 1832, the wife of the Russian ambassador to London organised a huge ball, and she recounted that in the room the ball was held in, where people were dancing and spinning, it was like they were up in the clouds, simply because you could no longer see people at the other end of the room, because they were engulfed in mist, in the smoke that had worked its way in. The fog also produced many interesting lighting effects, and as such it intrigued and interested some of the top impressionists, including Monet. Particularly towards the end of the 19th century. Between 1899 and 1901, he made 3 trips to London specifically to paint these lighting effects. There are also amusing letters he wrote to his wife in which he complains. He complains that there isn't any fog, especially on Sundays. He complains when there's too much fog because he can't see anything. But that's what made Monet's job so exciting, because that's what he wanted, to paint the moment, to paint an instant of a particular light, a particular play on colours. But at the same time, that kind of instant is sometimes so fleeting that it's hard to capture. The London fog was very quickly linked to criminality issues. Tourist guides recommended that people travelling to London take great care because London was a city of crime, particularly at nightfall when the fog began to rise. It's particularly true of the poorest and most dangerous part of London, which was the East End. That's where after 1888, the famous Jack the Ripper murders took place. This was in Whitechapel, not far from the Thames, where there was a natural mist anyway, but when the fog intensified, it meant that the murders multiplied too.
December 1952, the worst episode of air pollution in the history of London. A 4-day smog, which claimed over 10,000 lives. Parliament finally decided to legislate. Coal-fueled heating was banned. London was finally taking measures against the smog, a century after the first deadly ones had arisen. The first skyscraper in New York was neither a housing block nor an office block. It was a bridge whose pylons reached over 100 meters high. For the first time, Brooklyn Bridge established a link between Manhattan and the rest of the world. But for New York, it meant much more than that. Before that, New York had no skyline. It was a city without grandeur, nor height, nor viewpoints. But gradually, as the bridge took shape, New Yorkers found themselves in a new dimension.
If you lived in Brooklyn or if you lived in New York City, you watched day by day as this stone structure was being built in the middle of the river, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And soon it was bigger than the tallest buildings in either city, and then it kept going. So it became this oversized structure. It seemed to dwarf the cities that it was connecting. Bridge building was not a science at the time. Engineering was not the science that we think of it now. It was very imprecise. It was an obscure art. There were people that said, I know how to build bridges. And everybody else would say, okay, well, I see you built one and it stands, so you maybe know what you're doing. But nobody really understood how they worked.
New York was a city of engineers, and John Roebling was one of its first great representatives. Born in Germany, he graduated from engineering school in Berlin. His passion was suspension bridges. His idea was steel cables.
You take slender threads of steel and you twist them into a rope. That's what Roebling, the designer of the Brooklyn Bridge, does, and that's his first contribution, is not the bridge itself, but this notion of a cable of twisted steel that's able to support unimaginable amounts of weight. And then you turn to the Gothic past and you build these masonry towers without internal steel that incorporate the voids of these towers, incorporate not the solid part, but the absence of building is carved into pointed Gothic archways that look literally like a cathedral. And you are doing nothing more than building a conduit of traffic.
It would have been his life's masterpiece. However, John Roebling died of his injuries following an accident shortly after construction began. It was his son, Washington Roebling, who took over the project. But Brooklyn Bridge would eventually shatter his fate too. In order to lay the pylons, the Roeblings decided to use a brand new invention, which had been tested in France. It was called a caisson. The idea was to sink a huge stone tower into the river, then blow compressed air into a box, which would provide a space where workers could then dig. But there, the pressure was much higher than at the surface, and a fast ascent could be fatal. Many workers lost their lives to the project, and even Washington Roebling himself emerged paralyzed. His wife Emily took over the project. She was the first person to cross the bridge on the day it opened. New York had pushed back its borders. The city's population was at 940,000 in 1870. By 1900, it was 3.4 million. This is how it became the first American megalopolis. London, the biggest city in the world, was now within its grasp.
"400 years ago, a village by the name of Amsterdam began its mission to conquer the world, invented capitalism as we know it, and became the richest city on the European continent."
There was this sense among the Dutch that whoever you were, you could have a piece of the action. You could be involved in this great economic activity of your society.
100 years later, London, its main rival, took its place. The greatest trading power in the world, London endured terrific hardships, but went on to become the world's largest city and invented the megalopolis of tomorrow's world.
When the railways crashed through the poorer areas of London, people were just dispersed. They were swept aside, you might say.
Meanwhile, New Amsterdam had now become New York. It was under British rule. The city cut itself free and entered the fray. At the outposts of technical revolution, New York became the vertical city and created a whole new horizon for itself.
You watched day by day as this stone structure was being built in the middle of the river, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger.
Le terme de gratte-ciel, en fait, est intéressant parce qu'il renvoie à ce qu'était le paysage urbain de New York, la ville où on invente la notion de silhouette urbaine, de skyline. Le paysage urbain de New York il était constitué par les clochers des églises et les mâts des navires. Et en haut des navires se trouvait une petite voile triangulaire, la plus haute du bateau, que l'on appelait le skyscraper. C'était la voile qui était la plus proche du ciel.
The City Hall was where New York's skyscraper saga first began. At the end of the 19th century, 3 major newspapers set up their headquarters on either side. The competition between them was fierce. The winner would be the one that went the highest. 1876, the New York Tribune, with its 11 stories, was the tallest building in the world upon its construction. 1889, the Times building to the right was immediately overtaken by the New York World Building and its Golden Dome. The former was 15 stories high. The latter had 19 stories. While its 2 neighbors were built out of brick, it was the first building in New York to have a skeleton made entirely out of steel.
Avec la fonte, on pouvait monter à peu près jusqu'à 15, peut-être 18 étages. Avec l'acier, il n'y a plus de limite. Il n'y a plus de limite. La seule limite est la limite des capitaux du constructeur, puisque les ascenseurs peuvent être répétés et peuvent monter jusqu'au ciel.
15 years later, in the same square home to the City Hall, the Woolworth Building went a step further. (241 meters, 57 stories. It was Manhattan's first emblematic skyscraper. Not only because it was the highest tower in the city and would remain so for 16 years, but because its style and outline stood out from all those around it. This time, the building wasn't owned by a newspaper, but by one of the richest men of that time. Frank Woolworth was the owner of a chain of single-price shops named after himself. Everything was sold for 5, 10, or 15 cents. And in America, at the start of the 20th century, that was a winning formula. According to Frank Woolworth, the skyscraper's construction was paid for by the little pieces of change accumulated in his shops. In so doing, upon its construction, the Woolworth Building acted as a fantastic publicity stunt for Frank Woolworth himself and his company. But Woolworth and his architect, Cass Gilbert, had another stroke of genius, an homage to Gothic architecture, to European cathedrals.
How is this upstart nation, how is this upstart city going to take its place on the international stage? Well, it's going to do it by looking to the European past, looking to the masters, looking to the cathedrals, looking to the great works of monumental architecture. So when the Woolworth Building is completed in the early 20th century, and it's the tallest building in the world, it's a Gothic cathedral.
When you walk into the Woolworth Building, you're aware of walking into a kind of cathedral-like portal, which is quite monumental, and then into a lobby that makes you feel like you're in a magnificent church, but it's rather scaled down. It's scaled to the human experience.
And the lobby, interestingly enough, has a cruciform shape to it. Suddenly you're in a church, and you recognize that you're in a church, standing in the nave. I mean, you get it with the transept. It comes across. Okay, then you look at some of the decorative features, and you see things that look gargoyle-like. But when you look at it closely, you realize that that's not a griffin or something, that's a person. Okay, who's the person? It's Woolworth. And what's he doing? He's counting nickels and dimes. You look at another one of these gargoyle-like things, you see that it's the architect. He's memorialized himself. And what's he holding? He's holding the building.
The period in which the Woolworth Building was built was met with large waves of immigration into the United States, and therefore the arrival of dozens of thousands of European craftspeople. They were the ones who created the mosaics and decorations in the entrance hall. Here, it is the divinity of work being worshipped. And it's the goddess of trade welcoming a visitor as they enter the skyscraper. The Woolworth Building was just like a church, but it was a church of the New World.
It's not about the power of the king. It's not about reaching up to the heavens for God. It's not about contemplation. It's about rentable space where people are doing really ordinary, boring jobs. And yet, it's a cathedral of commerce. I mean, that is the quintessential New York idea, a cathedral of commerce. Like, it's an oxymoron. And yet, in the hands of a talented architect like Cass Gilbert, the Woolworth Building becomes absolutely seared in your brain as a memorable work of art.
By the time the Woolworth Building opened its doors on the eve of the First World War, New York had found its new dimension. Skyscrapers began sprouting up across Manhattan, giving birth to a new concept, the skyline, the urban silhouette. This landscape soon spread around the world. It was a demonstration of the city's newfound power and its global ambitions. Never in human history had an empire spread so widely. London dominated vast territories across 4 different continents, thus becoming the empire on which the sun never sleeps. The West End, the neighborhood of aristocracy and the upper middle classes, began expanding significantly. But here, the latest additions were not external. These London terrace houses had stayed more or less the same since their initial construction in the 18th century. But now, their interiors were beginning to change.
The growth of the terraced house in London coincides with the growth of consumption, of individual families buying things. And if you go back into the sort of 17th century, people didn't have many things in their houses because there weren't many things to buy. But by the Victorian period, the whole notion of shopping and buying furniture, decorative items for your house had exploded. The range of things you could get were absolutely enormous.
This was the first age in which a relatively average person could afford to live in a house that was decorated, that contained apparent carvings and high-quality finishes, because these were able to be mass-produced. Colours were being invented through the invention of new dyes, and so these places became much more colourful. And we were moving from a monochrome society for all bar the very richest through into something where you had very ornate, very colourful interiors in buildings.
And these little terraced houses, as a result, are unique because from the outside, they're very anonymous. Like an English person. No giving away of their character. But the moment you go inside, they were richly and individually furnished based on this extraordinary explosion of shopping and consumption that gripped London in the 19th century.
Such prosperity attracted growing interest, and the population of London tripled between 1850 and 1900, reaching 6 million inhabitants by the turn of the 20th century. The richest city in the world was also rife with inequalities. The poorest people were concentrated to pockets of poverty. No part of the city was spared. It was a time of revolution. It was in London that Karl Marx wrote Das Kapital. In 1886, the West End riots broke out. For 3 days, the violence spread through to the posh neighborhoods. It was at this point that a man named Charles Booth began his great project. To avoid future overcrowding, he thought it would be worth better understanding the population of London.
You have to imagine a typical Victorian businessman, an immensely successful ship owner. Came from Liverpool, came from Britain's second largest port in Liverpool. He used statistical analysis of trade flows, of inventories, of prices, and it was through his ability with applied statistics that he made his fortune and built the Booth shipping line into the very successful company that it was.
In the 1880s, Booth moved to London. This time, he'd use his mathematical skills to study the quality of life of the city's inhabitants. It was a huge undertaking, which he funded with his personal fortune.
His teams of investigators went out with policemen. The police were constantly patrolling the streets of London. There was no street which they didn't patrol, and there would be an investigator taking notes, house by house, of the condition of the property and the condition of the residents. And then, in the back room, these data were tabulated and mapped cartographically in these celebrated images of London, coloured in 7 different grades of colour, to give you the social geography of wealth and poverty in London.
Booth's study, published in 1902, is like a snapshot of a huge metropolis in turmoil. Yellow for the wealthy, red for those living comfortably, orange for mixed neighborhoods, light blue for neighborhoods whose inhabitants, albeit poor, had regular income, dark blue for areas where people were in chronic want, and black for those Charles Booth deemed to be vicious and semi-criminal.
Yes, it's true. There was a broad gradient between the east of London, London east of the Tower, and the west end of London. But as soon as you look at the maps, you understand that the social geography is much, much more complex. There were concentrations of deep poverty, very, very close to the beautifully manicured lawns of the Bedford estate. And equally, in the East End of London, there were respectable middle-class families living in the middle of what was caricatured as the jungle of the East End.
In his book, Charles Booth invented the concept of a poverty threshold, below which, he wrote, 1/3 of Londoners were living. 10% of the population of London, he added, had no chance of escaping this fate. Central Park had been finished, but around it, almost nothing else had yet been built. No houses, and certainly no buildings. This neighborhood, now one of the most luxurious in Manhattan, was little more than abandoned lots. So this is where the American economy's new millionaires were able to build their little castles, which were called the mansions. For about 30 years, this part of the city became a playground for all kinds of eccentricities.
There were no more than a dozen or so of these incredibly large mansions, but certainly there were probably 50 to 75 very substantial large houses, mainly on Fifth Avenue, as well as on Park Avenue, and then several hundred more smaller, still substantial houses.
And so New Yorkers nicknamed Fifth Avenue Millionaires' Row. The new residents were men from industries such as railways, steel, coal, oil, or finance. John Rockefeller, who would soon be the richest man in the world. He brought a pre-built house located a stone's throw from Central Park. The interior evoked all styles, all eras, and all continents. Andrew Carnegie, the Prince of Steel. He built his own mansion on a plot spreading half a hectare, which was a considerable plot size for Manhattan. His house is one of the only ones to have survived, alongside that of his business partner, the coal baron Henry Clay Frick.
It was tremendously expensive. Frick spent the equivalent of about $2.8 million to buy all of the lots, and this is a time when there's not a whole lot of other building on Upper Fifth Avenue yet. And then he spent even more, the equivalent of about $3 million to construct this monstrously large palace to live in and then to display his collection of art. It survived precisely because he designed the house to also serve as a museum after his death, and he made sure to leave enough money along with his collection to ensure its survival.
Henry Frick's mansion is an exception, because as soon as the First World War was over, these little palaces belonging to America's wealthiest individuals started to disappear one after the other. In their place, they built much taller buildings, which were incredibly luxurious, but much more profitable and glamorous. The first to be completed was the famous Dakota.
These were palaces in the sky. You'd have a building of 12 or 15 stories that might only have 8 or 10 families living in it. The apartments were usually arranged on multiple stories, what in New York is called a duplex format. So you'd have an interior staircase within the apartment that sort of replicated the feel of living in a multi-story house. In some cases, you might even get a 3-story apartment.
A developer would offer a huge sum of money to the owners of a mansion, which they'd eventually sell, thus giving way to one of these huge buildings. But most of the time, the owners made extra demands, and some demands bent all the rules.
There was a woman named Marjorie Hutton. She was the heiress from a breakfast cereal company from the Midwest, and she was married to an investment banker. They had built a mansion for themselves on Fifth Avenue. And one day a developer came along and said, "We'd like to buy your house and to put up a new building." And she agreed on one condition. And the condition was that she be given a custom-built apartment at the top of the new building. And she was given an apartment that didn't precisely replicate the architecture of her house, but to a certain degree did. She had custom furnishings, rugs, woodwork, other things that were replicated in the new apartment. In addition, she was given her own separate porte cochere with her own private corridor that connected to her own private elevator that took her straight up to the top of the building, where she enjoyed 3 entire floors to herself in 30,000 square feet. The largest apartment, to my knowledge, that has ever been built in New York City, perhaps anywhere.
Marjorie Hutton's apartment had 54 rooms and no less than 17 bathrooms, a record that's never been beaten in New York, even though several years later another apartment outdid it through sheer extravagance. Built in the new, very chic Upper West Side neighborhood, it was owned by a man named William Randolph Hearst. He owned the leading media group in the United States, and he was a very original character, to say the least.
He had a 3-story, triple-height living room that was decorated like a Gothic church with imported elements from Europe. And then each room was decorated according to a different theme, again, using imported architectural elements. So a French bedroom and, an Italian study, this, that, and the other.
At that time, the American economy appeared to have no bounds, and the First World War had accelerated the United States' rising power. This neighborhood was the fruit of years of recklessness and excess, which was abruptly put to an end by the Wall Street crash in 1929. Letchworth, 50-odd kilometers to the north of the British capital. While New York was revolutionizing architecture, London was inventing the urban structure of the future. Letchworth is now a cute little suburb of around 35,000 inhabitants. But it was the result of a radical project. A project dreamt up by a man who saw the solution to the city's complex problems in nature. His name was Ebenezer Howard.
He saw the problem of poverty as a byproduct of the city and of density. He wasn't interested in sort of social explanations or economic explanations. It was the city itself that created social struggle and discontent and unhappiness. And nature, the countryside, a better balance between the peace of the countryside, the tranquility of nature, and the economic opportunity of the town could be achieved if you rebuilt the town in nature. This was his big idea, the garden city. This developed into what we call the arts and crafts movement. The arts and crafts movement looked to vernacular cottages of the English countryside. The half-timbered frontages, the long roofs with their eaves, the gable ends, the open-plan interiors with the inglenook fireplaces. Wonderful, wonderful arts and crafts echoes of medieval building style. This represented a return from the world of industrial production to the world of handicraft, to the imagined equilibrium or utopia of a medieval society in which work would be local, people would make with their own hands.
The Garden City was built on former farming land, which by its very nature was worth practically nothing, but was enhanced by the new settlers. At the center, they established administrative buildings, public services, and businesses. Around these, they built the residential areas, then the industrial areas, then the farming belt. Everything was accessible via a star-shaped network of roads. But Howard saw beyond this and believed that the benefits derived from each garden city would be invested in creating new small towns dotted around London that worked on the same basis. The garden city would have therefore offered a countermodel to the megalopolis. Ultimately, this approach only worked once. But Howard's invention immediately caught people's imagination and acted as a basis to create from scratch a city.
So this was workers' housing of a very, very different sort. With a garden at the front, a garden at the back, a street verge planted with cherry trees, allotment workers' gardens for growing their own food, set in a small town surrounded by an agricultural belt producing fresh food for the town, owned by the municipality, owned by the people themselves.
At the time, most residents in Letchworth worked within the garden city. Many of them were employed at the Spirella factory, the biggest one in Letchworth, which was set up inside a very innovatively designed building. Here, most of the workers were women. They manufactured what was very sexy underwear for the early 20th century. Spirella saw itself as a model business, and its employees received far superior perks to the average British worker. On the top floor of the factory, they had their very own space. There, they'd engage in all sorts of activities: gymnastics, gatherings of all kinds, concerts and dancing.
Obviously, like all colonies, they had to attract colonists. And the colonists that they attracted tended to be progressives. They tended to be people who, like Ebenezer Howard, believed in social experiment. So it's in Letchworth Garden City that we see the first extensive experiments in wearing sandals, in dress reform, in vegetarianism, in sleeping out of doors at night. People had bedrooms with overhead gantries in which their bed could be swung out so they could breathe the fresh oxygen.
Straight away, the Letchworth phenomenon, a new city surrounded by nature, started gaining interest beyond England's borders. Paris, Brussels, Berlin, and even Tokyo each in turn tried to develop their own garden cities. London, the first metropolis in history, had just invented its antidote. In the decades that followed, Ebenezer Howard would help transform cities around the world.
By the early 1910s, there really was a new scale for the skyscraper, not just in terms of height, but also in the lot coverage and the girth and the blockiness of buildings that contained an enormous amount of floor space. And the best example of that is the Equitable building.
164 meters, 44 stories. Nowadays, the Equitable building is much like dozens of other office buildings in Manhattan. However, New York partially owes the way it looks today to this very building.
Ce qui est remarquable dans le cas de l'Equitable, dont le plan a la forme d'un H, c'est la densité et la rapidité des ascenseurs. C'est une gigantesque machine à faire circuler verticalement les gens.
48 lifts for 50,000 employees. That, now in Manhattan, is quite ordinary. But when it opened in 1915, it was rather revolutionary. The Equitable's neighboring buildings were considerably smaller. And in the narrow roads in South Manhattan, its arrival was not well received.
Depending on the time of the day, almost a 4-block area of lower rise and older buildings had been cast into the shadow of this titanic structure, stealing their light, stealing the value of the sunlight that was used to illuminate the space. Lights at that time, the bulbs of lights burned very hot, and they didn't really give off very much light. So light was a heat generator. Windows had to open in order to ventilate the space. So buildings were much more dependent on natural sunlight and the wind in order to create a habitable workspace.
Manhattan therefore had to find a way of building higher without upsetting neighboring buildings. And it was George Burdett Ford who found the solution. His idea was city planning regulations, which were adopted in 1916, and these were his instructions. First of all, vertically, you could build the equivalent of the width of the street or avenue bordering the building. Then you draw a straight line from the middle of the road. That way, you get a base structure which you can build on, but with setbacks. Depending on the neighborhood, residential or commercial, the main facade would sit at various heights. And one last feature was that on 25% of the plot, you could build as high as you wanted. This was the recipe behind the Empire State Building and hundreds of other skyscrapers in Manhattan.
And although this is purely a sort of technical formula that's about preserving light and air, one of the interesting things is very quickly it helps give shape to a whole new style of architecture in the city, a kind of ziggurat style of architecture.
Those kinds of recessive mountain or cliff-like projections give this very distinctive New York look, the zigzag that really kind of has a jazz age quality, because the way that light and shadow begin to develop in those right-angled spaces get a kind of frenetic energy that you see when you see it in black and white photography and when you see it in shade and shadow in the city.
Many of Manhattan's most famous buildings were the result of the 1916 regulation. They all seem to be part of the same family, and yet they're all different. 120 Wall Street with its stair-like shape. The New York Telephone Building and its unorganized silhouette. The American Radiator Building and its step-back roof. Or even the Chrysler Building and its rocket-shaped roof. These were all built within the space of around 15 years. Meanwhile, America was undergoing a period of huge economic growth in the wake of the First World War. Dozens of buildings were now transforming Manhattan's urban skyline, thus making it instantly distinguishable from others.
In the 1920s, the rise of the stock market and the rise of the skyscraper were companions. In fact, you might think of the graph of the rising stock market much like the rising profile of New York's skyline, with peaks and then valleys during times of recession, because skyscrapers are always connected to markets.
With the exception of the Woolworth Building, the number and height of skyscrapers in New York is well married to the growth of Wall Street, but with a slight delay. While the stock market was crashing in autumn 1929, the Chrysler Building was already under construction, and work was just about to begin on the Empire State Building. It was the apotheosis of this era of great skyscrapers. 85 stories, the tallest, the biggest, and the fastest.
The technology of its construction was really not exceptional. The steel skeleton had been used now for almost 20 years. It has a kind of kit of parts of steel beams and columns that are held together by rivets that workers in teams of 5 constructed with the enormous amount of effort and heroism when you see the photographs of the steel workers and indeed all of the workers on the site. But what was really extraordinary about the Empire State Building was first its scale and then its speed of construction. And really the genius of the Empire State Building was the construction management. In skyscrapers, time is money. You borrow money in order to construct the building, so the shortest amount of time you have that money borrowed, and the quicker that you turn it into rentable space, the more profitable the building will be. And the Empire State Building was built much faster than any skyscraper of its time.
1 story per day, on average, through the summer of 1930. The Empire State's construction took little more than a year. But when it opened, only a quarter of its offices had tenants. The king of buildings had arrived at the wrong time. It would only become profitable 20 years later, long after the Second World War. The Blitz, the intensive bombing of London by the German Air Force. From September the 7th, 1940, every night was a living hell.
London was an unmissable target for the Luftwaffe. It was a target 12 miles across. It is still, you must remember, the largest city in the world. It was bigger than Calcutta at the time. It was a vast target.
Since 1900, London had doubled in size. With its 8 million inhabitants, it was a low-density megalopolis. That was its great strength in this horrific ordeal.
The intense period of the Blitz lasted for a relatively short time between September 1940 and May 1941. In that period, there was bombing every night, 160 bombers on average coming over. The worst night, there was 580 tons of high explosives dropped. 250,000 people were made homeless. Their homes just disappeared.
The psychological effect was enormous. The sirens sounded everywhere. The entire population went down into the shelters. But in fact, in this low-density city of 8 million people, the impact of bombing was fairly localized. So we can see areas of very, very dense bomb damage side by side with large areas of London where everyday life carried on as normal.
In the first few weeks, London's docks in its industrial districts, as well as the city, its financial core, were targeted as a priority. But over time, the megalopolis was affected as a whole. The Blitz killed 30,000 people. It changed the face of Britain's capital forever.
What is, I think, so important about the history of London has been its ability to renew itself physically. And when we look at the Blitz, we are simply looking at a reprise of what happened when the railways came, what happened when the Great Fire came. It was an opportunity to start again, to revitalize the commercial, economic, financial infrastructure of the city.
At the end of the war, the city was but a shadow of its former self. It had to write itself a new story. It's well known what happened next. The city caught a second wind when Margaret Thatcher deregulated the financial markets. This decision greatly boosted not only activity, but also the planning of the old city of London, the original core around which the English capital had begun expanding in the 17th century. The medieval city, which had become an increasingly specialized business hub, is where the metamorphosis was accomplished.
I became the city planning officer in 1985 as the government was announcing the deregulation of financial services. This meant that the City of London was going to be opened up to competition and that banks from all over the world were going to be able to trade in London. Now we needed to incorporate computer-operated trading on large dealing floors in each of the bank's buildings. That required a very different type of building. And therefore a decision was taken that the city would have to go tall, would have to build skyscrapers. The city needed to go vertically because it could no longer build on any other way.
The influx of financial markets was now growing beyond the city's limits, so London's old docks began changing in appearance. The disused docks were converted into a business hub. They were the pride of London in the 19th century. Abandoned after the Second World War, they'd now found a new use. But the very concept of skyscrapers actually reached beyond the City of London's borders for the first time too. The Shard, 241 meters high, contains offices, but also luxury apartments. It's a new urban trend, one that started in New York, where it's currently changing the city. Of course, since the 1930s and its symbolic buildings, hundreds of glass buildings have been built in Manhattan. But none of them have led us to forget the great starts of its urban skyline. They will always remain iconic New York buildings, objects that form an integral part of its identity. In the future, however, there may be serious challenges. A whole new kind of skyscraper. They're called the super talls. 425 meters, 88 stories high. This one is currently the tallest skyscraper in New York. And it's a luxury residential tower. The super talls are curious yet exquisite objects, whose origin dates back over a century ago to when Cornelius Vanderbilt, the American railway king, decided to build the Grand Central Terminal, the terminus for his railway lines.
Building services Quito. Please report to a Taste of New York personnel.
Grand Central is, above all, a great architectural feat. But here, the real novelty isn't the main concourse. It's the underground platforms and their use, which one of the original engineers came up with.
L'ingénieur William Wilgus, qui est le grand opérateur du chantier de Grand Central, va avoir cette idée géniale de construire sur le vide, c'est-à-dire de créer un quartier nouveau au-dessus des voies de chemin de fer, tout simplement parce que les fondations des immeubles sont réalisées à travers les voies. Le sol est atteint à travers les voies, permettant ainsi à des bâtiments de se dresser sur un sol artificiel. Du coup, les promoteurs qui construisent les bâtiments n'achètent pas un terrain. Ils achètent un volume d'air, la possibilité de construire sur un volume d'air en posant ses fondations au niveau inférieur à travers les voies.
All the big cities in the world now use this method. However, in New York, the concept of air rights developed into something else. Take the famous St. Patrick Cathedral on Fifth Avenue, for example. Since it had no intention of giving way to a skyscraper, it sold a property developer its air rights. In other words, the space above it, which it owned. In exchange for said airspace, it received a small fortune. The same principle applies to all buildings that fall beneath the authorized limit in their district. They can decide not to build on the extra space they're entitled to build in and sell it to a promoter, who can build above the authorized limit elsewhere.
When you sell the air rights, you're selling that unbuilt space to a new developer who then is able to go to the city and said, I bought 20 stories. And literally the developer then gets to add that volume to the volume that he is already able to build. So if he's able to build a 30 or 40 story building and he buys 20 stories from surrounding properties, he's now able to legally build 60 stories.
This concept has now been applied to much bigger skyscrapers. There are customers keen for this new type of tower, and technology has made huge progress.
Engineering today enables you to build incredibly tall on a very small plot of land. So you can buy a plot of land that's 75 feet by 100 feet and build a tremendously tall building. There's really no limit. You could go half a mile high.
The first super tall tower was designed by Christian de Pont-Saint-Parc, a French architect. His apartments are the most expensive ever to be sold in Manhattan.
Views have value, and this is the trophy of the New York apartment, to walk out of the elevator into a domain that belongs to you and you alone, to see this commanding view of the horizon stretching in all dimensions. There is no greater expression of power and possession than a view of Central Park, an exclusive, singular place, even though the singularity of it is repeated 80 times in the sky until you get to the penthouse with all the floors underneath. 157 is reported at just over $100 million. There are others that have sold for $87 million, $90 million, I mean, almost inconceivable amounts.
These new buildings will remain a simple curiosity unless they're multiplied in years to come, revolutionizing New York's urban skyline. A once fairly uniform landscape is giving way to an irregular and chaotic horizon, as an expression of the new financial world behind skyscrapers in Manhattan.
Some of that market demand comes from people who have generated enormous fortunes in countries that have uncertain futures. So you have people with a lot of money from Russia and the Middle East and Asian economies where there are some very, very wealthy people, so they want to invest in New York City real estate. And they're essentially just using those buildings as a place to park their money.
In New York, an era is coming to an end. Soon, the kings of Manhattan will no longer be office buildings, but residential skyscrapers whose apartments are often second homes. Fortunes from around the world will dominate the skyline. It's a strange reverse situation for this city, whose main aim has always been to conquer the world.